All right, everybody, what is going on? I am here with Paul Carter, aka Lift, Run, Bang. Holy shit, man, you are a veteran. I don't think people realize how long you've been in this game for. Um, it's crazy that I'm talking to you now because when I started training 10 years ago, when I was 14, 15, once I started getting more into it, I used to read your shit on T Nation. I used to read your articles. So I'm curious, tell me a little bit about just, yourself, how long you've been doing this, how'd you get into all of this? How'd you get where you are now?
Yeah. The funny thing is about you bringing that up is that it's hard to stay, I think, relevant
Yeah.
um in this field and in social media. And I've actually been not like a bragging thing, but like somewhat relevant. I managed to stay relevant in terms of the fitness industry for a long time now. And that's a very difficult thing to do. We get a lot of people come and go
Yeah.
over the years that like spike up and get super popular for a while and then just fall off the face of the planet. And I feel very fortunate that I've been able to rebrand myself a couple of times. I'm essentially just out of my passion for what I've been doing in this field each time, not for like I'm going to redo this so that way I can have a business and that whatever. I could never do that. So uh, I've just been really lucky that number one, I loved writing, and so for a long time, I basically wrote a lot of blog articles. I wrote for pretty much every major online publication that existed, from T Nation to bodybuilding.com to Backroom Flex and Muscle and Fitness. When there was a lot, people would read a lot of like more
You
medium.
used to write in magazines, right?
Yeah, I wrote for magazines. I wrote for Muscle and Fitness. I wrote for Flex Magazine. I wrote for pretty much every, like I said, pretty much every major publication at some point that you can think of. And eventually I just got burnt out on writing so much. So I think in a lot of ways, the transition over into kind of what we do now with like Instagram and even TikTok, where you have kind of shorter
Yeah.
form captions, because I just got so burnt on writing 2,200 to 3,000, character articles for so long. I think I did 3,000 over 10 years.
Well, how did you even get into that to begin with?
That's a funny story, man. So I wrote a novel years ago, an actual novel. Had nothing to do, like, it's like a fantasy action novel.
Really?
And figured out I loved writing. So I was a computer engineer for 15 years, and I started lifting when I was 14. And I actually just realized I love writing. So I didn't, like a lot of people now, I think they try to manipulate social media to get popular or blow up. We know that people chasing clout and doing dumb stuff all over social media,
Yeah.
um, or posting thought shots or whatever it is that
Hmm.
people try to do to get notoriety on social media. And that was never something I set out to do. 100% never did. In fact, I tried to stay away from it. So I was really close friends with Jim Windler at the time, and a lot of people may not even know who that is. But Jim wrote 531, was super popular in powerlifting
He
and
wrote
strength.
531. Okay. Yes, I remember that.
Jim and I, we talked every day during the time he was developing and writing 531.
That's
So
crazy.
I even mentioned, I think in the second edition, he writes about some of our conversations in the second edition. So during that time, I was writing on my blog, just my own little articles because I love to write and I like writing about these topics and researching. And then Jim's like, well, what are you writing about every day? And I was like, just my stuff. And he's like,
Hmm.
well, can I read it? And I was like, no. And he's like, come on, man, let me read it. So I let him read it. He's like, dude, this is amazing. He's like, could I talk to Dave Tate at Elite FCS? He's like, could I talk to Dave about publishing some of your stuff? I'm like, no. He's like, and he kept after me. So I was like, fine. He's like, okay, yeah, I'll write an article for you guys. So I wrote an article and it blew up. And that's literally the whole story.
Wow. So
So from there, they asked me if I would write more articles for them. I wrote more articles for them, and then T Nation wanted me to write for them, and then I just kept writing blog articles, and that's pretty much how I grew. And then I was competing in powerlifting for all those years. So
you were
for
a competitive powerlifter. You
for
never competed in bodybuilding though?
Yeah, I did compete in bodybuilding after I quote unquote retired from powerlifting. When I got started lifting, it was all bodybuilding. Dorian Yates was like my idol.
Hmm.
I read so much stuff from Dorian and Mike Mincer and Arthur Jones, and I really gravitated towards Dorian was what I consider kind of like a thinking man's bodybuilder. In other words, he would something had to make sense to him, and then he would do his own research with whatever books and information we had like that at the time to make good decisions about training. And I always thought Dorian was like that epitome of like a thinking guy's meathead, right? So
Yeah.
he was the way he trained and his methodology and the intelligence behind it was something I gravitated to early and based all my training around. And that's how I got started training. I never really have deviated from that. But then when I got into powerlifting, a long time like after that, after a while, by the time that I retired powerlifting, I hated powerlifting. Um, there's a multitude of reasons because people are like, why'd you hate powerlifting? There's so many reasons why I hated powerlifting by the end. I don't even pay attention to powerlifting anymore. And when people were like, a lot of people would say stuff like, you just went to that to like create a business or whatever. Actually, I left powerlifting because I hated it. It just went back to what I originally got started in when that was training for muscle growth, hypertrophy, bodybuilding, and stuff like that. So the best thing, the most fulfilling thing that I had in my whole lifting career was retiring from powerlifting and never squatting, deadlifting again. Never doing any of that stuff. So
You
that
haven't done any of that stuff since.
no,
Not freeway barbell squats at all.
no.
Wow. Just because you hate doing it.
Dude, I just like I by the time I think one of the biggest things, and I don't know what powerlifting is like now, but social media wise then, and even with my own personal psyche, was that there's this sense of your sense of self worth gets predicated by how much you can lift. That's a huge thing in powerlifting.
Yeah.
It was then, and it was like you're not even a man. Like there's I remember when I pulled 725 from a deficit and there would be people like there's 181 guys that can do that.
Yeah.
It's never, and I
Yeah.
hated
No.
that whole like this your worth is measured by how much you can lift and whatever. Like I had a legitimate almost 405 overhead press.
Yeah. That's insane.
I was probably one of the strongest guys in the world overhead pressing wise, but it didn't matter. We didn't do the overhead press in powerlifting, but
Yeah.
you can never be strong enough. There's always going to be somebody that's going to talk trash on you or say that you're not good enough or whatever, that kind of stuff. And after a while, it becomes this consistent chase of more and more and more and more, and you're never happy. So you hit a big lift, and it's literally called a rival fallacy. It's a psychological effect that if you feel like if you achieve something, this particular thing, and you arrive at this goal, you're going to feel fulfilled and happy, and you will for about 7 minutes, and then after that, you're like, well, something better would make me happy. Something more would make me happy. So I remember the first time that I ever pulled 700 because that was a big deal at the time. Like a 700 deadlift was a good deadlift when I was competing. Now I think 800 is like the floor.
Yeah.
So I remember when I pulled 700, I was very excited. I remember literally being excited for like a day and then like, wow, that's not very good.
Yeah.
And when I retired, I was so happy to get rid of that whole mentality. Uh, like it's never enough. You're never strong enough. Like I competed without knee wraps or a belt or anything. And I squatted. My best squat was 660. My best deadlift was 725. I didn't hit those in competition. One of the things that I had a lot of trouble with too was like consistently battling injuries and stuff like that. So I just by the end I hated training. I hated going in, having to squat and bench and deadlifts and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And
Cool.
that whole sense of you're never going to be strong enough. I mean, I had almost 500-pound incline,
Yeah.
and I
That's
wasn't
crazy.
considered strong. I was
Yeah.
not considered strong by the powerlifting community. So I
Yeah.
had, so like you can deadlift 725 from a deficit and incline
Yeah.
almost 500 and overhead press 400 pounds and not be considered strong. And I just, that whole immature meathead community just grated on me by the end. So I was very happy to get away from it.
Yeah. Well, I don't know much about powerlifting community, but I talked about this a bit the last podcast I did with Joel. Just I did powerlifting training for a while, and I just hated it because you have these expectations going into every session. You have to follow these numbers, these percentages, and I would go in and I would deadlift, and it's like I should have one more rep in reserve or RP 10 or whatever. And if I'm not exactly on the mark, it would piss me off, and I just like leave the gym. It's if I can't hit this today, these numbers off this percentage, it would always just really frustrate me. And then also when I was younger, I did West Side. Are you familiar with West Side? West Side's
Of
program?
course.
Yeah, and that's how I fucking herniated my back for the past 7 years. I had herniated L5 from doing those speed days, those dynamic RDLs or whatever. You know what I'm talking about?
Mhm.
Yeah, that fucked me over big time. But I
I think that there was so much I could literally go on probably a multi-day rant about how much bad information came out of Westside Barbell.
really, yeah,
Like there's so much bad information. It's not, and a lot of people get upset when you say that because they're like Louis Simmons changed the game and those kind of stuff. I'm not saying Louis didn't have anything good to offer, but a huge part of what was wrong with Westside was there were too many people that didn't understand most of the stuff that you did at Westside was geared towards literally geared lifting, like lifting in squat suits, lifting in bench shirts, and it didn't have application to somebody who wasn't using that stuff.
you know.
Louis also believes stuff like box squats strain the hamstrings and like stuff just doesn't like we had no that's absolute nonsense. But you couldn't convince those people of that because Louis was like a god. So there was a lot of really bad information that came out of West Side, and that I feel like that really that made geared lifting like made it way less efficient than it could be. And then eventually people figured it out. Oh, you if you want to be a good non-geared lifter, you have to not wear like gear, and then you have to actually train the lifts like you do going to use them in competition, doing stuff like box squats and board benches and a bunch of speed deadlifts. They don't really have their place in raw lifting.
Yeah,
So not for the most part they don't. But as far as other stuff you said, yeah, it's more um, of that approach of I got to hit these particular numbers. That was another thing I hated by the end is I got to go in and I can remember days exactly what you just talked about, where you go in and if you don't feel strong, like your whole session's blown. So if
yeah,
I'd go in and like 405 was like heavy on the incline, I would just be done for the day and just leave the gym.
yeah. Just get
Right.
pissed off. I would leave.
Yeah, I'd be like if I barely hit 405 on incline, that would be like a 5 or 6 rep, like kind of max for me normally at that time. And if it was heavy, I would just leave.
Hmm.
So there was there was no sense of like it was always that constant, right? Like for more and more and more and more and more.
Yeah,
And one of the most freeing things that happened when I quit powerlifting was I got back to just enjoying training again, and it's never waned since then. So like I still love and I love training for all those years, and I realized powerlifting sucked the life out of me in terms of like training enjoyment. So I don't. I think those guys who get addicted to hitting bench numbers or squat numbers or whatever, they don't understand there's going to be a point of diminishing returns with that. And after a while, training just kind of sucks.
yeah, yeah. So you powerlifted for you said 10 years, and so you were in computer engineering for 15 years, right? So how
Yep.
did you get into the whole coaching? Being an educator within the community, was that just through writing and like researching as you got more into that?
Yeah. When I was writing, of course, for years, like when I was doing powerlifting stuff, I did a lot of research into like strength development side of things, like rate of force development, rate coding, looking at stuff that they were doing over in Russia with like Shiko, and then why you get some of the outcomes they do, motor unit recruitment and all that kind of stuff. And then why compensatory acceleration training actually worked really well. And then my powerlifting training started being based more around compensatory acceleration type stuff. And then I learned how to actually program going into meets better. But by that time, I was already kind of getting near the end where I was burnt. So when I switched over and got back into just training like bodybuilding and stuff, I really got back to like looking at okay, so what are the hypertrophy mechanisms? And the truth is, we've come a long way since that happened. I'd say in the past few
Oh
years,
yeah.
we've um, people would say stuff like, "Well, nothing new has come out." From a muscle physiology standpoint, there's a lot. We know a lot more now than we say we learned new
But
5 to 2.
you could just see in the way that people train, just compared to when I started training 10 years ago, the shit that all the bodybuilders I knew, just what was standard, 6, 7. Some guys would train 7 days a week. It was always short rest times, it was just
Yeah,
much, much higher volume. The way I guess Dorian had it back then was much less common.
he had it right close from the get go. John Meadows was my best friend for like 10 years, and like me and John by the end before he passed, um, he had started even coming around because we used to have these conversations like a couple of years ago when I was doing more and more and more research on a lot of these fatiguing mechanisms and stuff like that. And I would tell John and I would talk. We talked every week, a couple of times a week. And I told John, I was like, bro, all this stuff you're doing, like these drop sets and like the crazy intensifiers, they don't really do anything like extra. Like they don't like this killing yourself stuff that you like to do. Like I know you probably just think it's fun. And John would throw the anecdotal stuff at me. This guy does it, that guy does it. Then, but by the end, he kind of realized he's like, yeah, probably don't need to do like quite as crazy as stuff. But I think he also just enjoyed a lot of that,
Yeah.
and I enjoyed pushing himself to those limits. But it's finally started to take hold. I think for a lot of people to understand that those intensifiers aren't giving you anything extra. Like they aren't giving you anything on top of what you would just normally get. Once you reach the threshold for maximizing myofibril protein synthesis, however much mechanical tension that it takes for that muscle to reach that threshold, anything that you're doing after that is just going to create more fatigue, peripheral fatigue that you're going to have to recover from in the subsequent days after that. So that was, I think, a lot of that stuff has come to the forefront. There's just a lot of things from a training standpoint. I think that's changed over the last few years because of better research, because of some of these things have been brought to light. So I think we've actually made like leaps and bounds in terms of like knowledge compared to where we were a decade ago.
Okay, so I want to come back to that. So I want to start off by saying, but prior to now, you say mostly that mechanical tension is the only driver of hypertrophy. We used to say there was three primary drivers: metabolic stress, muscle damage. I've seen people say they believe there might be another driver. Why were people saying that before? Was there research to support that metabolic stress and muscle damage would contribute to hypertrophy? All three of them would, or are we still lacking research on those as well? And now we just have research confirming that mechanical tension is the driver.
So that was some theoretical stuff that came up a long time ago because there was number one was a belief that an increase in metabolites would kick off anabolic signaling. So that was a belief for a while. I think the other one you're probably thinking of now is that cellular swelling probably can create or the nuclear flattening. There's a multitude of ones they come along every few years, and they always tend to fall flat on their face. So it for proposed for a long time, it was that muscle damage happened. And the reason why that they saw that muscle damage happened was because there was an increase in anabolic signaling after muscle damage. So the people would say, okay, well, that means there has to be muscle growth from it. But it was only an increase in muscle protein synthesis that went towards repair. So it didn't actually go towards adding new contractile proteins, which is myofibril protein synthesis. So we actually don't understand some of the things that we still don't is there's some gaps in between kicking off mechanotransduction and what happens between there and mixed muscle protein synthesis and myofibril protein synthesis because they're not the same mechanisms. So myofibril protein synthesis is where we add new contractile proteins, and that's where we get hypertrophy. But mixed muscle protein synthesis goes towards just repair and recovery. So when we would see muscle damage, when we would see the mechanisms that we call muscle damage, we would see that increase in anabolic signaling, but we actually know now that it is only that part that increase is the mixed muscle protein synthesis that goes towards repair and regeneration. So it doesn't go towards the addition of new contractile proteins. So that one, we actually see there's a multitude of studies you can go look at where they're done in isolation, absent of mechanical tension, where you see the same things with like lacerations, contusions, and all that kind of stuff. There's a repair process that happens. It's absolutely the same thing. We see the same thing. But clearly there's no hypertrophy that occurs with that. So the key the last few years, understanding was that we had to have those things happen in isolation of one another. So in other words, we needed to have metabolite accumulation happen in the absence of mechanical tension. Well, we did that with blood flow restriction, right? So you can do blood flow restriction, just like get an increase in metabolites by putting blood flow bands around somebody's limbs, and you will see an increase in all the metabolites. However, it doesn't do anything to cause myofibril protein. In fact,
But doesn't that just make you reach mechanical tension with like lighter loads essentially?
what happens is that the increase in those metabolites cause fatiguing mechanisms, and those fatiguing mechanisms give afferent feedback to the nervous system. So what they cause you to do is you have to voluntarily give a higher degree of effort. So what happens is
Yes. Okay.
by getting a higher voluntary degree of effort, create higher degrees of motor unit recruitment, and then you end up reaching fatigue with lighter loads. So you end up with mechanical tension. So there's nothing special that happens there. So what we had to do was see that there was an increase in metabolites. So when you saw an increase in metabolites, Did we see any of the anabolic signaling happen, or did we see mechanotransduction happen? Did we see anything that led to myofibril protein synthesis? The answer to that is no. So the once we saw that happen, we saw a bunch of other things start to fall in the face. Like we can see massive increases in metabolites and like certain types of interval training and stuff like that, but we don't see muscle growth. So some of those that we saw, for example, we see satellite cell proliferation, and they would say, oh, well, the satellite cell proliferation that goes towards higher degrees of myonuclear domain, but that doesn't mean that there's hypertrophy that occurred at the same time, and we've seen those things too.
Well, what
So
this makes me think of, you look at guys like Lance Armstrong, those guys who ride the bikes, I forget what it's called. Some of those guys have huge quads. So that would be through metabolic stress. Would that not be?
well, they also weight trained.
I don't know if they actually like religiously train like that,
Yeah,
but
one guy that people used to talk about that had these really massive quads, and he was a cyclist. And then, but then the videos came out of him doing like pause squats, like 605 for reps, and I'm like, well,
yeah,
that's where it's coming from.
I guess.
So,
Yeah.
the metabolic stress stuff has actually at this point been debunked pretty well. There's even a whole it's ignored by some. Here's something I don't know if you know, Sebastian, is there's a whole conglomerate of the quote unquote evidence based community that absolutely ignore massive degrees of the scientific evidence that comes out because they have such cognitive dissonance that they don't want to fucking see it.
I know
So,
that.
say
Yeah.
what?
I know that. A lot of the guys who claim they're evidence based is like it seems
Are
like
not.
they're the exact opposite. They just fucking spread something like it's the gospel. They don't actually understand science. They just are very narrow minded and fucking, stuck on one thing.
Well, when you get dug in like a tick on some hypothesis that you created, I think what happens over time is that rather than when people's egos are very large, they end up just doubling down on those. There's a whole meta-analysis on lactate, right? So there's an increase in lactate when you have metabolic stress, but it absolutely doesn't do anything for muscle growth. It's largely ignored by the scientific community. So when lactate gets dispersed, it basically goes throughout the entire body like that. And if metabolic stress caused muscle growth, or lactate was, for example, like something that caused muscle growth, then you would see muscle growth happen like all over the body, right?
Yeah.
Because that dispersed everywhere after that. But that doesn't happen. If you saw an increase in metabolites from basically blood flow restriction, then you would see, even if um, even if it didn't happen, let's say it only happened with mechanical tension, if it actually caused an increase, you would see an additive effect. So in other words, you would see regular heavyweight training to failure, and then you see blood flow restriction. Well, if the metabolic stress created an additive effect, you would see greater degrees of hypertrophy outcomes, but you don't. So it's either like roughly the same, but you don't see anything happen when you just get metabolic stress without the mechanical tension. So the muscle damage thing was actually debunked a long time ago, but then you still literally have some people in the quote unquote evidence based community still putting up that nice little tier thing, that triangle that says metabolic stress, muscle damage, and mechanical tension. Well, right now, the only one we are 100% positive of is mechanical tension. Muscle damage is pretty much debunked completely. Like it absolutely does not cause muscle growth.
But there is still possibility that we just might not have the research that metabolic stress could add to that, or you're saying it's, basically we know that it doesn't.
Right now at this point, when you look at the entire body of evidence over the past decade, there's nothing that's ever supported that metabolic stress will drive muscle growth. So, like I said, there would have to be an additive effect. Another thing that should be very clear to you, for us to know that metabolic stress doesn't drive muscle growth, is the fact that when you look at rep ranges and hypertrophy, for the most part, they all create the same hypertrophy outcomes. But yeah, with higher reps, we're going to have more metabolic stress. But yet, sets of 6 to 8 end up producing the same amount of muscle growth as sets of 20 to 30. Whereas sets of 20 to 30 are going to have far more metabolic stress than sets of 6 to 8. But there's no additive hypertrophy outcomes.
So what I have recently, looked into a bit here, and I don't think there's a lot of research on it. I don't know how much you know about it, but I have heard people saying that these higher rep ranges can possibly result in more sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. I don't know if you know anything about that, if there's a lot of data on that, or what does that really
We
mean to
have
you?
So what we understand about sarcoplasmic versus the whole sarcoplasmic for myofibril hypertrophy is that you can't train for them. So there's research out there, very good studies done that shows that we see sarcoplasmic an increase in the sarcoplasmic proteins and then see increase in the sarcoplasmic area while a decrease in I believe it's like the actin myosin myofibrils. And this happened with low volume heavy load training. So what we understand now, or possibly understand about sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, is that it's just a transient part of the process or a precursor to myofibril addition. So it looks like it's just there's a process that happens when there's going to be muscle growth happen, and it might be that the sarcoplasmic area increases in a short term span before you get the myofibril additions. But you can't train for like I'm training for sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. You can't do that. There's no way to
No,
do it.
no, no. But would that higher rep range result in more sarcoplasmic hypertrophy along with
No,
the?
that's what I was getting at is like we've seen it with all rep ranges and volumes and stuff like that. So what it appears as is that the increase in sarcoplasm is just a transient process in the whole metabolic process of adding new either myofibrils in parallel or sarcomeres in series, whichever way, whether hypertrophies occurred longitudinally or transverse. The increase in sarcoplasmic area is just something that happens as a transient part of the process to hypertrophy.
Okay, okay, I got you. I see what you're saying. So you say intensifiers, all this stuff, it's just for fun. But what about the whole aspect of driving more blood into like you see guys like Milos, right? The whole giant sets, utilizing is there a part where, utilizing things like insulin or being on PDs or driving, the blood flow higher using those intensifiers, having higher reps, can that have any purpose really? Or you think that's just all bullshit?
I think it's just all bullshit.
Really?
Yeah, I think that um, when you use all those higher reps and use all that kind of stuff, you're going to end up with higher inflammatory responses, right? Because there's going to be a lot more muscle damage that occurs with those higher reps because more volumes, more reps, stuff like that. You're going to induct more calcium ions into the cytoplasm. So when that happens, you're going to end up with a lot more muscle damage. When you end up more muscle damage, you end up with higher degrees of inflammatory response. And a lot of those guys, that's why you end up hearing a lot of guys be like, well, when I switched over to doing high reps for leg, my legs grew. I think all that's happening there, because this is what I'll tell you anecdotally, I've seen from that, and we can go back to the research, show why that is. Whenever they diet down, their legs aren't bigger. They'll have bigger legs in the off season, and they're doing all these high reps and whatever, and there's a non-contractile fluid response.
Yeah.
So, and we've seen that when we see MRI with people when they've been doing eccentric based training, and you have to account for the edema in the muscle, right? You actually literally have to account for that when you're trying to measure out true hypertrophy that's occurred in a muscle. And I think all that happens when people do those high reps and all that kind of stuff is that there's just a higher inflammatory response associated with it. So they may look bigger, right? Because a lot of guys will say that. Well, when I started doing low reps or 6 reps, I lost a bunch of size or fullness or some bullshit like that. I'm like, there's just less inflammation that's going on, which is a good thing. So that's pretty much all of that stuff.
Do you know the reasoning why, someone like Milos does those giant sets, like what their argument for that is essentially?
no, I mean, like I don't. Charles Poliquin, who was like one of my mentors, he liked giant sets and all that kind of stuff too. And a lot of times they would believe you can go back and look at this, and there was a time when they believed that more fatigue actually created greater adaptations. Now we know it's actually the opposite. Is that when there's central fatigue within the training session, you're going to recruit uh, fewer high threshold motor units due to that afferent feedback, and you're going to have fewer fibers that end up being mechanically loaded. So when you do those giant sets and stuff like that, all you're actually doing is inducing more and more and more fatigue and more muscle damage within that session. So you're not getting a greater degree, you're not mechanically loading those fibers more.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that all makes sense. I just wonder, we have all this research. Why do these guys keep doing this? Do you think they're just stuck in their ways or?
I mean, that's possible. Like I never was honestly. I never was a big believer in giant sets from the time that I started training because they didn't make a lot of sense to me.
They're
Even
hard to fucking do to begin with unless you have like a whole private gym.
well, here's the thing: when you think about failure, right? One of the things that a lot of people don't think about is task failure. So, task failure and muscular failure are not the same things. So, if I have you doing a giant set of like 8 to 10, 12 reps or whatever, and I have you doing 4 exercises, by the time you get to the last one, you can hit failure simply due to the fact that there's a lot of metabolites that have been built up within that muscle, and it's just very painful, or the fact that your cardiovascular system doesn't allow you to continue. So task failure can happen for a number of reasons, where muscular failure is very different. That means your muscles are the fibers that are active simply aren't capable of producing more force to continue to lift the load. Those are
Yeah.
not the so when you actually hit task failure, you can hit task failure for a number of reasons that don't have anything to do with the fibers not being able to produce more force.
Okay. So with that being said, what do you think about utilizing? Do you use intensifiers in your training?
I do sometimes because of the fact that I still think training needs to be fun. And I think there's something to be said for the mental stimulation aspect of
Mm-hmm.
doing, challenging yourself or having intensifiers to break things up and make changes. I think that's another reason why somebody asked me a few weeks ago, they were like, well, if everybody's making all this progress in their groups, and they do, but then why do you still change the mesocycle every 8 weeks? And that is because, and you should probably know this from your own training, is that even when you're going in and say you continue crushing like PRs or breaking, new rep PRs or adding more load to a specific lift, after a while you just get tired of doing it.
Yeah.
You just I just don't want to do this lift anymore. And I think there's something to still be said for the mental stimulation, that dopamine hit of, hey, having a new program, having some new lifts you're doing. And then, of course, like there's absolutely some neural adaptations that occur that I think that continue that, because anytime you start a new lift over the first few subsequent weeks, you see big jumps, right? Like in load or reps or whatever. And then that tends to level off. So I think from the terms of using intensifiers in your training, I think there's a smart way to implement them to where you're keeping the amount of fatigue reduced, both within the training session and then when the days after. I think there's a smart way to do them, and that is the same kind of thing. That's why I do what I call like micro drops. So if I do a drop set, there's no freaking point in doing drop sets if you're going to do like say 10 reps and then 10 reps and then 10 reps and like that's a really dumb way to approach stuff like that drop
Yeah.
sets. So I think there's a way to approach intensifiers that can make them more productive. Bio reps are a good way. Rest pause can be a good way depending on how it's implemented. Drop sets can be good depending
Yep.
on how
Well, if
they're.
I was going to do a drop set, it'd always be, to go to failure on that drop. Like there's no go. I would usually say, choose a weight where I'll probably get maybe 8 to 12 reps around that, but, go to failure. That's the point of the drop, not just hit 10 reps and stop.
Right. So, like for example, on a drop, if I get 6 to 8, then I'll do the drop, and then I do a drop to where I'm only getting 3 or 4 reps after that. Then I do another drop and get 3 or 4 reps after that. So I try not to. You're not going to get 5 effective reps, in my opinion, 5 stimulating reps every time, due to the simple fact that each set you do, even in straight set fashion, with 3 minutes rest between set, is going to be less stimulating than the previous set done before that, just because you're going to accumulate more fatigue as you go throughout the workout. So when you do a drop, there's going to be fatigue, residual fatigue from the first set into the second set into the third set, or however many drops that you're doing. And the more fatigue you have, the fewer motor units you can recruit in those subsequent sets.
Okay. So what do you think about utilizing intensifiers in somebody who's like a beginner? Just because most beginners simply most likely aren't pushing to actual failure on a straight set. So using that intensifier will help them get closer to that.
I don't think so, because with beginners, they're going to grow with just about anything, and I think
Yeah.
using intensifiers with beginners is really bad, because you only get so many times to go after that to get those adaptations. So you take a beginner and you let them get all those neuromuscular adaptations that are going to happen simply because the body is creating that stress response, right? That remodeling due to that stress response that they're just not used to. So they are actually going to get mechanical tension because they've never recruited
Yeah.
those, or they've never used those muscles before. So or those fibers, the fibers that are controlled by the high threshold motor unit. So the only time that you ever mechanically load them is during lifting. So, and when you have slow contraction velocities. So when we're talking about beginners, I just don't see a need, because they just grow so well off just getting them into doing some work, whether or not they're getting a
Yeah.
true failure. I think that's something they can get to later. I also think it depends on the lift. You can strap pretty much anybody, beginner, intermediate, or advanced, into something like a leg extension and get them to failure, right? Because it's just
Yeah.
a highly stable brace position. You're not having to coordinate a bunch of stuff. But you ever put a beginner on a dumbbell bench press and see what that looks like?
Yeah. They fucking look like they're going to blow their
It's,
shoulder out.
it's a circus act. So when people tell me stuff like, yeah, dumbbells will take a lot of height, they don't take a lot of stability. I'm like, okay. So when you watch a beginner do them, what do they look like? Well,
Yeah.
you create those adaptations, but that need for stability is always there with that lift, right?
Yeah.
You've just created those motor patterns. You've created the coordination for those motor patterns, but the need for it's always there. So, but if you sit down, you can put a beginner on a chest press machine and just adjust it so that it's right, for their structure, and tell them to, hey, press out and go failure. Make sure they're, that they're not like getting stupid with their elbow position and stuff like that. But
So that
uh,
brings in another question here that has been pretty controversial. You especially coming from powerlifting, what do you think squatting specifically, not necessarily bench or deadlift, do you think learning how to free weight barbell squat should be crucial for somebody beginning in training?
no,
You don't think so? You don't think
no,
having that movement, just being able to have stability and have coordination within that stance would somehow translate to maybe less injury risk down the road, or something like that? There's just, I don't know why, it's just engraved in my head that you should know how to barbell squat.
I think that's just because everybody's been told that, right? Like beginners have to know how to barbell squat, but and I always ask the question of why, and then it usually comes back to that it's some kind of functional pattern. I'm like, well, not really, because even in, like, for example, sports and athletics, and I'm good friends with a lot of NFL players. None of them are in like a deep squat stance when they play, right?
No, no, yeah, no.
They're not. Like, I'm good friends with John Welborn. He played for the Eagles and the Chiefs for years, and he trains like a lot of NFL players. When we talk about this, it's like when you're in alignment position, you're barely flexed at the hips, right? Like you're at maybe 40 degrees of flexion. You're not even
Like
close to.
maybe like a low bar squat, maybe like.
So yeah, I don't think, if your goal is maximizing muscle growth, for example, let's say you're built like Tom Platz, then sure, man, choose the squat because that might be a really good lift for you. But if you have longer femurs, and you can't effectively load your quads very well because you turn it into more like kind of a good morning, or you're in a more highly hip flexed position, you're just going to load your hip extensors. So it's going to be a lot of adductors and some glutes. So it really just depends on the person. Like if a beginner is really, if they're built well, their structure is well to squat, or they just enjoy squatting, sure, use the squat. But I don't think there's all beginners must learn how to squat, because there's some unspoken rule that's been hanging around for a few decades that said all the beginners need to learn the big three. That's some bullshit. I don't agree with that. I think there's some backwoods Mark Ripito nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, it's just engraved in my head. It makes sense, bench, deadlift, because deadlift, you could still RDL, you could still stiff like a deadlift. If with bench, you're still using dumbbells, probably you have stability in there. But if you never barbell squat, all the other options are stabilized options. So I don't know why. I just it's also
Well, when
hard
people
because
say stuff to me, they used to say, when, like, if you present, like, okay, I would say, well, why can't you do a Smith machine squat? And somebody would say, well, you're not working your stabilizer. And I
yeah,
would say, what stabilizers are you talking about? They can never answer that question.
yeah, no. Well, the stable it would just be having coordination, being balanced.
It's a coordination. It's literally just a coordination pattern. So anytime that you get into higher degrees of coordination in a movement, the larger the perception of effort becomes. And then do you think about the squat? This is like one reason why I could make a multitude of reasons why I don't think the squat's a great selection for the majority of people. But when you use a lot of different muscles in an exercise, then you effectively don't mechanically load one over the others, say, unless you're built for it and you have specific joint angle ranges of motion you can get into without compensating with other things.
Yeah,
So a lot of people can't do that with squat. And we actually know, like, through tons of research, a lot of people don't know these because I don't give away everything, was that as soon as you get into heavier loads on a squat, it becomes a hip extension movement anyway. It doesn't matter. Like, it happens every time. We've seen it repeat over and over in certain research that look at squat patterns and joint angle ranges of motion. So when you get into heavier squats and heavier deadlifts, it becomes far more of a adductor magnus glute movement regardless.
okay. Well, you say, you can't effectively, load the muscles, but does that really, because you just said, beginners are going to respond to anything. So does that really even matter for a beginner? If let's say that beginner can, perform a squat well, they have the right, build for it. Would that
Right.
even matter that they're not effectively loading the quads compared to really a hack squat at that point?
Well, again, we'll come back to their structure. So if their structure dictates, say, if you're trying to use the squat for a good quad loading pattern, right, and they can get into that deep degree of knee flexion and still have that very upright torso, and then their shank angle for like their tibia is
Mm-hmm.
very interiorly, translated forward, then then you could use a squat, right? And if they enjoy squatting, I'm just saying that the argument that made that beginners have to learn how to squat because it's some functional movement pattern, that's not, I don't think that makes any sense.
Yeah. Well, what do you think about all the people that, hear this? It's weird because all of us, everybody like up until this point has learned how to barbell squat. So now it's like we're entering this generation of where we have beginners saying, I don't need to squat. And I don't think we really have people that have really developed great physiques that ever really went down that path. So everybody's stuck on, you have to barbell squat. We all did this.
Yeah, I think when you look at it is definitely a change, right? Like if you look at all the top physiques, and that's not always like the best way to judge it, but the fact is that people top bodybuilders or was it a classic physique, whatever, most of them don't barbell squat.
No, at
And
this point, no.
and they all have great quads. So most of them don't barbell squat. I think that is something that's actually, I think, in a good way has effectively died off as a must do lift. Whereas like, oh, you have to barbell squat. I'm like, no, you don't have to. Like, we're still just, if you want to mechanically load the quads, there's other options you can use.
Yeah. 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 But I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it all makes sense. It all makes perfect sense. But I just something tells me if somebody can't barbell squat, that they're just gonna have like this poor mobility that's gonna transfer into something else somehow. Like maybe if it's like just them doing something on a daily basis where they just don't have, they're not used to that position, maybe. But you're saying it's all bullshit, and I believe you, but it's just engraved in my head. It's like this fucking meathead thing
I think
engraved in me.
that is definitely something that has been engraved in your head because that has been repeated so often throughout the quote unquote functional community and fitness and all this kind of stuff is that everybody has to learn how to squat. And then what you'll hear is the squat is a functional movement. And then they'll show those pictures of the fucking baby down doing like a full squat and say you've learned how to do how to squat and you lost learn how to squat. I I don't believe any of that.
Okay, so to any people who are watching this, listening, they're beginners 1, 2 years in the gym. Is there a reason for them to not squat? Because you have all these guys coming in here and saying, "Well, I shouldn't squat if I could get more out of the hack squat." But are they going to get
Yeah.
more out of the hack squat if they're able to get more raw stimulus from a barbell squat? Say they can do it effectively with good depth,
But what's raw stimulus?
just more overall load. They're able to load more. They're
But
able
if
to
they're
put more fatigue on the body, put more muscle damage, I guess, essentially. When you
but
say that,
muscle damage doesn't drive hypertrophy.
no, but I guess it would be more mechanical tension in every aspect. Your glutes everywhere because you're involving more. It's like with a bent over row. You have your erectors more
Right.
involved compared to doing a chest supported row.
You're always going to be able to lift more when you involve more musculature, but that comes back to what I was just saying. If I'm trying to effectively target specific tissue, then I would want to involve other muscle groups less to some degree.
Yes,
So,
yes, yes. But as a
so
beginner, is that really important? I need to isolate my quads, specifically trying to bias my quads in a squat rather than just trying to like the barbell row. Just getting more involved. Is that better for me? Just building a foundation of mass here, or should I try to isolate this more and bias this more?
I think with beginners, like I said, is that you can get away with a beginner to give them a foundation just off using like compound lifts like that because they're just going to grow from doing pretty much almost anything. You could put a beginner on a BOSU ball with dumbbells in their hands and have them doing that for a while, and they're going to get growth from that. I mean, beginners just going to grow from anything.
Yeah.
So when it comes to that, there's if I put a beginner on a leg press and I have them grow massive quads, like 30-inch quads over the next 5 years, did they miss out on something that they wouldn't get from having squatted? So I don't think so. I think now the argument can be made for this is um, that basically what we do generally see is we see a bit more quad hypertrophy with deeper squats. However, I could say, okay, well, let's just use a deep hack squat or a deep pendulum, because that's all that's happening is that we're getting the quads a little bit more lengthened. The quads have a length and tension relationship that allows them to experience high degrees of passive tension that creates more total tension on those fibers. So there's nothing. If I want to look at quads and I want to really maximally train the quads, and what I'm looking at is I'm looking at a movement that can give me the maximal amount of knee flexion that I can get
Yeah.
without overloading the hip extensors. And what I said earlier was when you get into heavier degrees of squats, what we consistently see, unless you're literally built like a Tom Platz where you have like short little femurs and long torso, but if you even have like average anthropometry, like for most people do, like within some range, what just generally is going to happen is you get into heavier loads, you're just going to load the hip extensors. So it's
Mm,
just going to I think the squat personally is mainly an adductor magnus movement for the majority of people.
okay. I mean, yeah, it makes sense. What do you think about the argument of, let's say, this person could squat perfectly fine. They could do hack squat, either or. Because beginners will also make the argument now. They all talk about the fucking stimulus to fatigue ratio. A barbell squat will create too much fatigue, and is that even necessarily true if somebody's squatting
That
185 pounds?
stuff came out of Renaissance periodization. I don't agree with, and there's nothing that supports those statements.
That it creates too much fatigue? Yeah, no.
What when they say stimulus to fatigue ratio and they say stuff like the big lifts cost more fatigue, if I'm like, well, what's the mechanism? Somebody needs to explain to me what those mechanisms, because we do understand fatigue mechanisms. So when I say what are the mechanisms that a big lift causes more fatigue, because you still hear this shit, and they'll say stuff like, well, doing a big lift like a squat, like a max squat of 5 reps causes a ton of systemic fatigue. I'm like, no, it doesn't. What are the mechanisms? Tell me the damn mechanisms. I get really fed up with people just making this bullshit up.
Mm-hmm.
So if you say it causes a bunch of fatigue, explain to me what those mechanisms are, because we understand all the mechanisms behind fatigue. So what are they?
Yeah. Because people will come to me, they'll say, well, why will I barbell squat when I get a hack squat and I'll get less fatigue out of that? And, there's that whole other argument we talked about. Sure, if you're built for it better or whatever, you want to, focus in on your quads. But if the simple argument is this is going to produce more fatigue, so this is why this is better, you're saying
What
that's bullshit.
say that, and I asked them what fatigue are they talking about. So are they talking about central fatigue, or are they talking about are we talking about peripheral fatigue, or are we talking about fatigue at the sarcolemma level? What are we talking about? They can't ever answer that. It's just
Yeah.
something that's repeated for a long time that nobody knows what they're talking about. So when I say we understand fatiguing mechanisms, so I can put you on a squat or I can put you on a hack, and the whole stimulus to fatigue ratio. I'm like, well, what are you talking about? Like, what
The
is the
stimulus is high.
what?
The stimulus is high to begin with. So how does it have poor stimulus to fatigue ratio?
The stimulus is contraction velocity. That's mechanical tension. Is contraction velocity. So if we want mechanical tension, the fibers that are active to experience mechanical tension, there has to be a slowing, voluntary slowing of contraction velocity. That is the stimulus. So when we talk about fatigue, we talk about where does fatigue come from? Well, we know fatigue comes from higher reps. We know fatigue comes from more volume. We know fatigue comes from whatever, but fatigue doesn't specifically come from a lift. So when you say, people will say, here's what they misinterpret. Perception of effort is a type of this feels hard, but that's not fatigue.
Yeah.
That is a completely different thing. So perception of effort, when you use a big lift like a squat or a deadlift or whatever, there is an increased perception of effort. And what that perception of effort does actually is makes it so that the lift feels harder. And then what you actually end up doing is you actually recruiting fewer motor units for the muscles that you're trying to target, because they have to be dispersed out through a larger area. That's something I was trying to cover before. So if you're using a whole bunch of muscles, you have to recruit, and the size, the central the size of the signal sent from basically the motor cortex can only be so large. You can only recruit so many motor units, right? So if you're having to recruit a ton of different muscles to do a job, there has to be number one coordination with that, and that's the perception of effort part. And then the signal sent from the motor cortex basically says, I can only recruit so many motor units to do with these specific fibers, because everything has to work, whether it's co-contractions, coordination, or whether it's changing the joint angle ranges of motion. So when they talk about this stimulus to fatigue ratio, I always ask, what's the fatigue you're talking about? So, and nobody can ever explain that. So the idea, somebody will say, I think the argument will be like, isn't something like a, like a leg extension, like that way you don't be experiences, or are we talking about quad fatigue? Are we talking overall just like how that this feels harder.
I don't. The way
So
I think they're talking about is like, yeah, they just get more, burnt out.
tired.
They have higher central nervous system, involvement, and they just feel tired after the workout, so they can't, effectively do it. Or maybe they're talking about more localized fatigue, and in that case, you doing 185-pound squat is not going to create that much localized fatigue. No, am I wrong?
No, it depends on how you like they would depend on the person. So like if you're doing 185-pound squats and you do like 50 reps, it'll create a lot of fatigue. But if you're doing
No,
100,
if you're doing like 8 to 10 reps, like that's how strong you are. 8 to 10 reps max, 185 pounds. You're not that strong. That's not going to create a lot of fatigue.
um, like it's relative to the person, right? So it's the amount of are we talking about central fatigue? 8 reps, probably not creating a ton of central fatigue, regardless of the load. It's all about the person. As you get into higher rep ranges, we create more central fatigue, and then we actually create more peripheral fatigue. So those fatiguing mechanisms generally just come with higher rep ranges. So if you do, I mean, you can actually even test all these
Yeah,
particular
I'm
theories.
talking about localized fatigue, like in your quad fatigue.
Yeah.
The recovery ability of that.
And so when we talk about peripheral fatigue, well, what we're talking about is like a mechanism where there's a reduction in the amount of cross bridging that happens between the actin and myosin. So that will happen because there's been too many calcium ions dumped off in the cytoplasm. And so then what happens after that in those subsequent sets, when there's peripheral fatigue happening there, is that you end up with something called excitation contraction coupling failure. And that is where the actual voltage sensor, which it basically interprets the signal sent from the nervous system, can't communicate with the calcium stores to be dumped off into the cytoplasm to cause muscular contraction. So you end up with um, less force is being produced at the fiber level. That's that fatigue.
Okay, and what does that cause after that? What does that result in?
You don't end up experiencing as much mechanical tension in those fibers.
Okay. Uh, so why do people say that they can't recover from that though?
What do you mean?
They'll say it causes too much fatigue. I can't recover from it. That's what
They're tired.
this this is there a difference? What I was trying to get at is there a difference between somebody,
Yeah,
me 10
I,
years ago, 185 pounds versus me squatting 500 for the same amount of reps now? Does that cause more damage? Does that cause more fatigue? Even though it's relative to my perception of it, is that causing more peripheral fatigue?
no,
No.
because when you get no, because think about it this way. Every time as you grow and there's more adaptations that occur, this is like another thing for you to think about. Hopefully you'll have an aha moment. So if you go from squatting 185 for 6 reps to
Yes.
squatting 205 for 6 reps, did you increase the stimulus on the fibers?
It stays the same.
Right, stay the same.
Yeah.
So you go from 205 to say 225 for 6 reps. Did it stay the same or did it increase?
It stays the same as you go up.
Right.
Yeah.
So even if you get to 9,000 million pounds, you had all those adaptations that occur all the way up to that level. So the stimulus is the same.
Yeah. So I understand what you're talking about. So you're saying that more load necessarily doesn't transfer over to anything else. Because you also said, once you get to a certain point of when you're squatting so much, it starts to become more adductor magnus, more glutes, more hip hinge. Why would
Yeah,
that be?
the joint angle range of motion changes. So we just simply compensate because they're better. Those you're using larger muscle groups to change those joint angle ranges of motion. So we simply just change the joint angle ranges of motions to use stronger muscles.
So if you're doing that, would that result in the movement being more tiresome?
No, you're just going to create the adaptations in those fibers that are doing the that are being responsible for doing the load.
Okay, so my whole argument is my thought process is bullshit. This is essentially what we're getting at.
That's one that's been around for a long time, right? It's like, so if I'm squatting 500 for 6 reps, I have to be causing way more damage and fatigue than the person who's squatting 185 for 6. And I'm like, no, you created all the adaptations to get to 500 for 6. So in essence, the stimulus is the same.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you remember when you were squatting like 315, like the first time for like 6 reps, you get super sore, right? Like,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know, you get tired the same kind of way. And then after a while, 315 feels like nothing,
yeah,
right? And then you can do 405 for like, 5 or 6 or whatever. I mean, you can get super sore again, right? Like
yeah.
up those stretch ion channels, with muscle damage, but the stimulus is the same. So there's that long belief that's like, oh, as you get stronger, like there's more fatigue associated with moving those loads, so you don't recover as fast. But there's actually no mechanisms that we can look at that actually prove that.
Well, maybe if you don't consistently squat, and right now I just hopped into 600, I'm not adapted to it, that would be comparable to that, but that's not even relevant. If you're just doing random exercises you're not adapted to, they're going to
Right.
be more fatiguing. But yeah, yeah, I mean, yeah, that all makes sense.
When I think about when people talk about fatigue, when I come back and I'll ask them, it's like, but what mechanisms are you talking about? And that's something like, Chris and I will be rebooting the webinars. And when we talk about fatigue, we are talking about like perception of effort is something that you use during the set. And that gives feedback that says this is really freaking hard. And I think people misconstrue that for fatigue. I think that's what they construe as fatigue. But central fatigue is a testable thing. So, for example, central fatigue means that we are suffering from central fatigue and that the signal sent from the central nervous system cannot recruit as many high threshold motor units as it can in a fresh and recovered state. This is a testable thing. You can test it with an explosive movement, like a medicine ball throw or jumps or something like that, because you have to recruit a lot of high threshold motor units for those movements. So that fatigue is testable. You can test peripheral fatigue through basically those stem contractions, right? So it's called low frequency fatigue. So whenever they use those electrodes they put on you and they shock, they cause contractions. When you're actually suffering from fatigue at the peripheral level, you'll suffer from something called low frequency fatigue, where they use low frequencies on those contractions. Your muscle doesn't respond. So all of these fatigue mechanisms are testable. This belief that you're going to load up a bunch of heavy weight and do something that it causes a whole bunch of fatigue, well, I will say, what fatigue are you talking about? And nobody can answer me other than it makes me really tired. That's not fatigue.
So when you do a heavy hack squat to failure, fucking maybe do intensifier or whatever, you're on the floor, you feel like you're gonna throw up. That's not central fatigue.
I like no, like
No.
unless you did like what causes you to throw up is not central fatigue.
Just that feeling, when you're dead after a set. You're
Right,
dead.
but
Yeah.
I find that usually occurs after high reps.
Oh, that'll happen to me on like a squat if I'm doing even 8 to 10 reps to failure.
Yeah.
But I mean, I don't know if you've seen the way that I train. I train kind of like fucking how like branch trains, like just very like I'll have like somebody force me 2 reps, like I'm like pushing my system into absolute overdrive. So maybe that's why I get so fucked up afterwards.
Yeah, and so that when you're talking about that, where you're doing like say 8 to 10 reps and you've hit failure and you have somebody helping you do force reps, you're
Yeah,
just more fatigue. You're not actually doing anything to get like higher degrees of mechanical tension out of the active fibers.
yeah. So that would be central fatigue though. Yes,
Um,
yes.
no, that would be more for peripheral fatigue.
Okay, okay. So what you say, you're not getting more out of that, but you're extending the time you're experiencing that mechanical tension. No.
No, actually, what you're just doing is, for the most part, that's happening there is like when you're adding those force reps and stuff, um, you're just spending more time where you're just dumping more and more and more calcium ions into those active fibers. So the fibers are active for longer periods of time. So there's a higher degree of central fatigue that does occur, but there's a lot more muscle damage that occurs from those particular kind of sets. So that's exactly the fatigue I was talking about earlier when I said you end up with a peripheral fatigue, where in the subsequent sets you just don't produce as much force at the muscle fiber level.
Mm-hmm. Well, this okay. So that
So
kind of
the
that kind of confused me.
whole
So
this will hopefully this will explain it. So the whole two RIR, two reps in reserve thing. The reason why that they say that's less fatiguing, and some people don't understand this, is because those last 2 reps to failure are the ones where you end up with the greatest amount of peripheral fatigue. So if you're doing a set of like 8 reps or 10 reps or whatever to failure, those and you're getting to true failure where you can't do another rep, those are more peripherally fatiguing, right? And then subsequent sets, you end up with basically getting like a type of like calcium fatigue, where the muscles are no longer responding to the calcium ions that get dumped off and to cause basically are the catalyst for muscle contraction. So you end up with less cross bridging that occurs due to that.
okay, so by extending a set and doing those force reps, you're saying it's actually would have a negative impact.
Mm-hmm.
Really,
Mm-hmm.
really. Yes. That's interesting. But so it's the last five reps or so to failure where you experience mechanical tension.
Yeah, there's a slowing of contraction velocity. So the whole
Yeah.
five the stimulating reps thing comes from it's a very sound theory. It's actually Boards for Deadlifts is the guy that came up with it. Chris made it more popular, but Chris credits that Boards came up with it, and it's pretty sound. It's pretty it's foolproof really because consistently in EMG and isometric contraction research, we see that all of the basically the maximum amount of recruitment that's going to occurs around 85% of one rep max load, right? And then we see kind of a drop off in recruitment that happens within, say, 3 to 5 reps of hitting failure, right? You get maximum recruitment during those, and then it just drops off. There's no any more after that. So, and then we know that basically that muscle fibers are going to experience mechanical tension, experience the greatest amount of force when there's a slowing of contraction velocity, because that's when the greatest amount of cross bridging occurs. So it's really two factors that come into play. Number one is the size principle, and the other one is the force velocity relationship. So those are the two things that essentially kind of make up the mechanical tension paradigm. So when you get past those 5 reps and you're just continuously pushing, what really is just happening there is like you're just getting more and more calcium ions that get dumped off in those, but you've already had all of them dumped off in for the cross bridging to occur. Because every time that you get a cross bridge cycle that has to occur, calcium ion has to release the troponin from the tropomyosin chain. So that's because there has to be a binding site that's open for the myosin heads. So that's how you get basically the whole power stroke thing where actin and myosin, where they pull on each other. And then you get a muscular contraction. So when you need calcium ions to get dumped off in to feel those contractions. And then as you get to failure, when you think that's when you have the maximum amount of force that the muscle fibers can produce, then there's a lot of calcium ions that get dumped off into those, right, to produce those maximal amount of contractions. And then when you keep going, all that happens is that you just incur more and more muscle damage. So the fibers can only produce force to a certain point, and then they're fatigued, they're tapped out.
Okay. So what is the difference between stopping? So let's say those last 5 reps are the most important.
Thought process. And mind you, I still train to failure, even with telling you all that.
Yeah.
I like a rep. I personally, it's just a personal thing. I don't like reps in reserve type of approach
I don't like it
because,
either. Yeah.
yeah. So the whole idea, some of the people who the reps in reserve approach is to keep you from suffering too much of that peripheral fatigue. So then in these subsequent sets, you still are able to have high degrees of mechanical tension that occur in the sets that you're doing very close to failure without incurring too much peripheral fatigue that interferes with that happening. So you're staving off some of the peripheral fatigue, right?
Yeah.
By a couple of reps in reserve, right? So the more that you train to failure, train to failure, train to failure. Remember, I just said earlier, every subsequent set produces more fatigue. So is it producing more for central fatigue? If you're doing lower reps, you don't have as many metabolites that end up interfering with motor unit recruitment because of afferent feedback. Then if you do more reps, you end up with more of that, but you also end up with more calcium ion related fatigue. So the whole point of leaving a rep or two in reserve is to offset some of that calcium ion related fatigue so that in subsequent sets, you still end up being able to recruit more high threshold motor units. So you have less peripheral fatigue, and then you're able to experience the maximal amount of mechanical tension in the reps that are close to failure. So that's the idea.
But couldn't you just do less volume going to failure?
Yeah, I mean, if you go in and you're fresh, and let's say you do a set to failure, that first set is always going to be the 100% right into the workout. Like that first one you do to failure is going to be your most, in my opinion, your most productive set. Because if you're recovered, right, if you're not suffering from any central fatigue or if you don't have muscle damage, like you're recovering from peripherally from a previous workout, that's going to be your most effective set, right? Your first
Yeah.
one right out of so that's another reason why we see this too. Another way I can show you this is that through all of the research we consistently see, whatever muscle group that you train first in the session, like has more muscle growth. That we've done these studies where like where you place the whatever muscle that you're training first. Well, the reason why that is because there's less fatigue in the early parts of the training session. So if you're doing less volume, you are not incurring as much yet. Less volume, lower volumes, you're going to have less fatigue in lower volumes. So you're getting into that kind of that ballpark where I kind of base my own training paradigm around. It's lower volume training to failure, and that's what I've done in all my groups and seen phenomenal results. So those are anecdotes. I know what the research says, but at the same time, this is kind of how I feel about that. I think if you tell most people to train to failure, they always end up naturally going 1 to 2 RIR anyway. So it
Yeah.
kind of sort of.
So with that being said, since most people naturally won't actually push to failure, they would benefit from having some additional volume within that.
Yeah, and that's a lot of times, if that's kind of the happy mediums that you're having to find out. And what I do, like for example, like with my groups, I work with a lot of people, so you have to find those happy mediums because some people are going to train to failure, and then some
Mm-hmm.
people are probably going to be 1 to 2 RIR, maybe even more. Like we have some research that shows that especially for beginners who they have the further away you get from failure, the larger the margin for error becomes on where they estimate their failure point to be. So that's why I think it is super important to actually spend. We were talking about this earlier too with beginners to try to get them to train to failure, which is
Mm-hmm.
why I think squats are necessary because I would rather a beginner cultivate that ability to know what failure is. Right, that's important to know. So even if you're going to train to a 1 to 2 RIR, it's super important that you have spent a lot of time training to failure, so actually you know what that really is. Because a lot of people are like, "That's 1 to 2 RIR." Yeah, I don't know if you train with people where you can watch them and they think they're either close to failure, and I'm like, it's not even close.
Yeah, no, I've trained with people in person. I have all my clients send me form evaluation videos every week just to make sure they're have proper execution and proper intensity. And I tell them before they said like 99% of people, there always is something that can be improved upon and they're always not close to failure almost in like 9 out of 10 cases, especially when we're talking about legs. That's always the biggest one.
Yeah, and I think that's because the perception of effort with legs is so high, right? It's a large
Mm-hmm.
muscle, right? So
Yeah.
that's you're asking about it earlier. It's like when you're training quads, we have quads. You can't get away from doing, even if you're doing a hack, you're training a ducker, something still got to extend the hip. You're still training some glutes, something got to extend the hip.
Mm-hmm.
You're just taking away some of that coordination, those coordination issues, right? So those are, but if you're doing it, in my opinion, a true hard set of 8 to 10 on a hack is freaking hard, bro. Like
Yeah,
a
it is.
true.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's why when people talk about these ultra high rep sets, I'm like, a 10 rep set of hacks is hard. I don't know what these people are talking about. Maybe they haven't really trained really close to failure or to failure, but to me, a 10 rep set of hacks is brutal.
Yeah. Well, I think people just don't go heavy enough to begin with. They settle for less weight. They just are stuck on that number. A lot of people convince themselves they hit failure when they're not close to it. They don't realize that. Like I train with,
But that's what I was
you know,
talking about. That the longer this goes on, you're starting to. I think you're starting to see like you're making a point. So when people hit what they consider failure, a lot of times it's task failure. So they're getting that feedback from their body that this hurts and it's painful and I don't want to continue.
yeah,
Or cardiovascular wise, they're tapped out. So a lot of times people hit what's called task failure, but that's not real muscular failure. Those are two very different things.
yeah. Of course, that's why it's easier to hit muscular failure on lower rep ranges.
Right.
It's just not going to move. Like I press, all right, it's not going up. I'm not even tired. Like it's just that's it. It's over. So,
Right.
but even with legs, I mean, like you said, just the perception effort is higher. So even when you're doing, 8 reps on a hack squat, it's still more cardiovascular.
Well,
Cardiovascular.
the perception of effort's always going to be higher on multi-joint exercise than it would be on like single joint stuff. But that doesn't necessarily make them quote unquote more fatigued. There's, like I said, when we talk about fatigue, there has to be mechanisms. And
Mm-hmm.
then like something feeling hard is related to perception of effort. And that has to do with the size sent from the central motor command.
Yeah.
So those are different things, but people get that misconstrued. Have you ever not done this? Have you ever felt exhausted, went to the gym anyway, and then crushed everything and that day? But you've done that a million times, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, bro, if you ask these bro science people, they will tell you I have fatigue. That's not fatigue. That's simply feeling tired. But if you walked in and you tested your motor unit recruitment, I bet it's off the charts, despite the fact that you feel tired.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So people mechanism mixed up all the time. They're like, I feel tired of this lift is hard. I'm like, that's not fatigue though. Fatigue is a measurable, it's literally measurable. Whether it's central or peripheral, there's ways to measure.
Yeah. Something I want to talk to you about, because we talk about this a bit on TikTok, is you said rest pause sets could induce more fatigue, not be as beneficial. Because what I had previously said was, if we took one rest pause set versus, one straight set, and one rest pause set, when I refer to rest pause set, I'm referring to all three of those attempts within that. Or
Right.
something I feel like I got this from you like a long time ago, a 50% set. You know what that is? I
Yeah.
feel like I
Yeah.
50%. So what, take one of those, or one rest pause set versus one straight set. The one rest pause set, you are extending the time that you're experiencing that mechanical extension. You're getting more out of that set. No, is that not more beneficial? Obviously, depending on the exercise, not like a squat or something, but maybe like, a fucking chest press machine.
So I think a way to rephrase this so that way we can get on the same page is that let's look at how many failure points that we have. So if we have, rather than talking about like reps and all this kind of stuff, so if we do a rest pause cluster and we have three failure points, the first one, and then we rest 20 seconds, we hit failure again, rest 20 seconds, hit failure. Those are three failure points, right?
Yep.
So we're looking at the cumulative amount of stimulating reps that we had across those three failure points. So if we do three straight sets, with say 3 minutes rest between, and they're 5 day reps or whatever, and they're all to failure, we end up with three failure points there too. At the very best, a rest pause set due to those short rest periods, when you're like first getting into the gym, at its very best, you might be able to get something equal to the three straight sets with longer rest periods in terms of the number of stimulating reps. You're never going to get more. So if we're talking three failure points, so three straight sets with rest between or a rest pause cluster, that's why we end up seeing a mixed bag, all depending on how it's implemented.
Yeah, it
So
all depends on the total workout.
the implementation and methodology all matter and get super nuanced when talking about these particular things. So if I did a rest pause set, like the way that Dante used to describe it, because I think that most people don't know, like Dante Trudell was like really big behind
Yeah.
implementing.
Or D-Say training.
Yeah, so the way that Dante, and I love Dante, and we have a great relationship, but like the way that he would recommend to implement rest pause training, I don't agree with, because it was a lot of high reps stuff. And we do know we know through contraction or velocity loss studies and everything else, high reps 100% produce more fatigue, more neurocentral fatigue. That's not even like a debatable topic. We have a ton of like data that shows that. So if you're doing a rest pause cluster and say you hit 13 reps on your first one, rest 20 seconds, go to failure, rest 20 seconds, go to failure. You're not going to get as many stimulating reps as if you did three straight sets where you did 6 reps to failure on each of those three sets. You're not.
No,
So
no,
that
no, no, no. But then you would have to do those three straight sets. People, I'm comparing like, it's people will, because, everything gets fucking, twisted online. Like I'll say, if we're going to do two straight sets versus I'll do one straight set, then the second set I'll make a rest pause cluster, that would be better essentially. I mean, obviously depending on the whole workout, but you would get more out of that.
again, I think the implementation always matters
Yeah.
in this. So, for example, in my groups, I just rearranged some of the rest pause training for the previous mesocycle. And I did not see, and we're talking thousands of people, I did not see the results I normally see out of progressive overload that I see when we just implement our straight sets. When we went back to straight sets and a bro split for this last one, saw freaking crazy results in comparison. So I think that, and that's another topic I was hoping that you're going to bring up, this whole frequency thing and bro splits and stuff.
Yeah,
So
I want to talk about it.
so I at best, this is what I think about intensifiers like rest pause or drop sets or stuff. I think you can get pretty near equal stimulus and save yourself some time in situations like that. If you enjoy, my recommendation for people who like enjoy doing stuff like that is just to make sure that you're staying in those kind of lower rep ranges, so that way you are reducing the amount of fatigue that you'll be dealing with within a cluster. So implement a cluster, like a good way to, in my opinion, implement a cluster is to hit, say, something like 7 or 8 reps on the first set, and then you leave maybe 1 to 2 RIR in there, and then just hit failure points with the next two. And I
Yeah.
think that's implement like a rest pause cluster.
Well, I think people just take the statement and they just run with it, and they think, why would I ever do these if straight sets are superior? And they don't look at like the overall picture here, where it's like, if I'm going to do, let's say, like 3 chest exercises and I want to do, 2 to 3 sets on them each or whatever, for me to get the same amount of stimulus from one rest pause set, I'd have to do those 3 straight sets out, and it's just going to add more volume to the entire session when I could get that done in less. Just overall, how the whole workout set up, it might make more sense. It might be better to just do that rest pause set than having to do another additional 3 stage sets, depending on how you want to train, really, right?
Well, it depends when you say volume. I think that's how you're defining volume. Are you talking about when people say volume? And I always think like a volume of what? Like you have to define what the volume.
Total working sets.
Okay, so what is the stimulus that creates? What's it a volume of? We're looking for a volume of stimulating reps, right?
Yes. Yes.
Right. But we have
You're
to
saying,
volume is we have a quantifiable thing. So if we're going to say a volume of something, it has to be a volume of something.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it
yeah.
could just be a volume of tomatoes or a volume
Yeah,
of
well, because
like
I know some people measure volume and like the total weight. I know your app or whatever I would see you post, it has like the total volume for the
yeah, I
weight
don't
or whatever.
but like first if we're talking about like how much like if we're trying to reach that threshold, right? For muscle protein synthesis that happens um by way of getting to a certain amount of mechanical tension that the fibers experience within a training session, we have to say a volume of stimulating reps, right? Like that's the volume that we're really talking about. So when
Yes,
we talk
yes.
cluster, how many stimulating reps are we getting out of the cluster in comparison to how many stimulating reps are we getting out of the straight sets to failure? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and you said straight sets, it's if not the same, straight sets might be a little bit better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it could be a case where it's like I said, I think you can implement it and they can at best a rest pause cluster can be as equally stimulating and save you a little bit of time as the 3 sets. Because when we talk about the 3 straight sets, I think the bigger thing is that you're talking about is that you do a set, you got to rest for 3 minutes. You do a set, you got to rest for three
Yeah, it
minutes.
just extends the whole time. Maybe I'm doing now, I have to do way more in the workout.
It's not the volume, but more or less is that it's the amount of time that it takes me to get to those stimulating reps, right? Like to accumulate those stimulating reps. So with a proper drop set, right? Like if we've seen in some instances in the data where like a drop set can get us very similar degrees of hypertrophy outcomes longitudinally. And then sometimes where it's not as much. And again, I think that when you have to go back and I look at that when I've gone back and looked at the studies, more times than not, it's just the methodologies of how they're implemented.
Yeah.
So I'll agree with you on one part and disagree with you on the other. I agree with you that from a standpoint of a rest pause set can be just as effective as the straight sets to failure. But what I think has to be quantified there is the implementation and methodology of how you're doing it.
Yeah.
So it has to be done in a way where you're mitigating the amount of fatigue that's incurred. Otherwise, you won't get the same amount of stimulating reps. And then, especially if you were doing a whole workout full of like rest pause stuff, by the
No,
time
no, no. Yeah, what
by
I
the time
always say,
you get to the workout, yeah, it's just super counterproductive at that point. So here's the other thing to add to that. If you're going to do a rest pause cluster, do it fresh, like first thing in the freaking workout, bro. So like do it when you know you're going to get the maximum amount out of those clusters.
yeah, well, I'll give you an example. So, for one of my back workouts, the first exercise was, fucking lap cable pullover, then a fucking pull down, then a row, then another row, something like that, 4 or 5. So the first exercise I would do though, the pullover, I would do a rest pause of 3 rounds. I would just do that one set rather than doing 3 straight sets to that, and then all the other exercises are pretty much just 2 straight sets, maybe a top set and a back off, just pretty much like that. Maybe there's one other rest pause set, but that's instead of
That's
having to do all 3 of those in the beginning.
a totally valid approach, 100%.
Yeah. So it just depends on the overall workout. And it's,
I
you
think
know,
those are the nuances, right? That need to be that you can't always get into in conversations on TikTok. Why I have to break foot off in people's behind so much because
yeah.
there it's some people say like it's not that deep. I'm like, well, it can be. It depends on what we're talking about because it's not an adequate statement to simply say straight sets are superior in every way than and people say, well, you said that, Paul. I'm saying no, I said intensifiers are not giving you anything extra, which I'll stand by. One thing they can do is get you to potentially a very similar degree of stimulus in less time. But
Yeah.
you need to implement them. And then, of course, again, like you just talked about, let's say if you did a rest pause cluster on a lat pull down, and then did a rest pause cluster on like a lat row, and then did a rest pause cluster on a lat like a pullover machine. I'm like, okay, that's not productive. That's not
Yeah.
productive. That's not how you'd want to approach that. So that wouldn't be the same. So let's say you did have 3 failure points throughout those clusters for those three exercises, you have 9 failure points. I wouldn't like, I would never, first off, number one, nobody needs people wild. They're like, what are you talking about? Nobody needs 9 working sets for a muscle in a workout. I don't, I like nobody. I really think nobody needs that many. When you look
Okay.
at Dorian in his prime, I mean, he didn't do like even for legs, right? I think quads got 4 sets. I mean, need so little comparatively to that what people think they need. And again, we do have a ton of research looking at how much to reach the threshold for maximizing muscle. And it's far less than people think. So,
Yeah.
but that comes back to like I wouldn't recommend if you're going to do clusters or drop sets or whatever, do it in the beginning of the workout when you're fresh, and then limit it to like specific rep ranges so you're just not accumulating.
Or even just auto regulating training. Cause I don't know if you auto regulate, but like let's say I'm halfway through my fucking workout and I don't want to do another 3 sets. Like I'll just do the rest pause set and end it here. Just being able to make decisions
I,
educated.
sometimes I reverse it, and I like it sounds like I'm being a hypocrite because by the time I get to something like biceps after back, I'm doing back and biceps. I just do a drop set for biceps and call it a day.
Yeah. But that's the problem with social media is everybody just wants, blanket statements, and we have to have a whole conversation about it. Really, it's not just as simple as saying, because I have clients coming to me, why am I doing rest positive straight sets better? I'm like, okay, well, do you want to do 3 straight sets in place of that now? Because now I've designed this the way it makes sense. And people just think, there's no way it could make sense because they hear this statement and run with it without ever really thinking about it. But
Yeah, I think just standing it on its head, like straight sets with a close proximity to failure, with long rest periods, are more. I'm not going to use the optimal word, but they have less fatigue, and then they get you to the stimulus. But that doesn't mean that every other intensifier method is not good. But it probably you have to understand how to implement them properly to
yeah.
mitigate fatigue that does come with it.
And I think there also does come a point where when you're training and you're so experienced, like you just understand how to implement these things. I mean, obviously, if you just take the time to educate yourself and you just have experience training, I feel like it just comes naturally to me. Like I know how to auto regulate my training, and also I know where there's a point in the workout where you say you're doing all these things that accumulate more fatigue, you're doing junk volume. Like I know there's a point where this is junk volume now. I know there's a point where the workout has become not effective. I could feel it essentially. And do you think that's the same thing? Like you could feel when the workout is no longer effective? Like my chest is, I have a debt.
There's that's a again that's a I think a thing that is developed throughout when you've been training a long time is that you can almost you hit a point where you're like, yep, I'm like I'm not doing another set of those, or I'm not I this is one too many exercises for this day.
Yeah.
I have a general rule. I don't do more than 4 exercises in a training session ever. 4 is a max. And I have consistently found if I try to go past that 4 exercise rule, my workouts suffer
For a muscle group or for the whole workout?
for the whole workout.
Really? What the fuck? That's crazy. So what? That's crazy. So how do you set up like a push pull legs? Like how do you set up like a full leg workout if you're doing push pull legs?
So rotational. So like if it's a let's say it's a push pull leg split, right? And it's a chest, shoulders, and triceps day. It's rotational. So a chest
Yeah.
day.
Okay.
So one day we might get one chest movement and then 2 shoulders and one tricep, and then the next one will get 2 chest, 1 shoulder, 1 tricep, and then the next one will get 2 triceps. So I think people don't know how to get creative with those kind of splits. So
Yeah.
what you want to look at is the total amount of volume that kind of getting hit over the course of say a 10-day period or whatever. And rather than trying to smash a whole bunch of volume into one session, I think shorter sessions that are like where you're going to failure and you're focusing on progressive overload, I've consistently found are better for, especially for me. I also do a lot less volume. People be like, "How are you? Like, how do you do so? Like, that's all you do?" I'm like, "That's all I do. I don't like I don't know what to tell you. I'm still like almost 240 pounds, and I've been all sauce for 8 years. So I don't like I have
You
according to all the other volume pundits, I should have shrunk down to basically prepubescent boy, never lifted a weight
you
size.
came
Or
off of everything completely on TRT.
yes, that's it. I'm not doing 500 milligrams of TRT like what you hear in some guys. Like I legit, it's like 75 to 100 milligrams a week of TRT. So
Okay.
it it's like real TRT. It's like by a doctor. Like I don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
I still get accused every week. I think you probably see the comments. People was like, well, if I was on much gear as you, I was like, when I was on gear, I was 290 pounds, bro. So like, yeah, I've been off everything. I'm very happy. My health's a really important thing. I prioritize that as like my biggest thing now. But like John Meadows and I used to talk about this all the time. John always thought it was just the training, and John did. People would say John did high volume routine. He did not. We trained together all the time. John did not do high volume training. People said John did high
Well,
volume.
what do you consider high volume? Because I feel like everybody's definition of what is low and what is high is like all
John
different now.
ever did one top set to failure. Sometimes you get a second set here or there, but most of the time we would do a few warm up sets. So what we call like a feeder set. A feeder set is where you get kind of close to failure, but if
Yeah.
you consider it a working set, but it let you know what your loading needed to be on your top set. Like, so in other words, if you were doing like leg extensions, like a feeder set would be, you're like, yeah, that's pretty close. But that, I can go up a little
Yeah.
bit more.
But a lot of my training is basically, I would say I got like it's very similar to Meadows and Dante, utilizing feeder sets, have one top set, maybe back off, have a rest pause set, like cluster sets. If you look at all of his they're very similar. The way that I have programmed my stuff is kind of
Yeah.
like him.
John and I always love to have those conversations because he never corrected people online. Be like, John Meadows uses all this volume. I'm like, no, he doesn't. And we trained together for years, and John and I always the focus was one top all out set. It was always the focus. And then people looked at his training because he would always include his warm up sets and feeder sets and say, well, John does tons of volume. I'm like, no, he doesn't. When we train together, if we do like, I don't know, like a back workout and like, we do say 2 warm-up sets, 1 feeder set, 1 all-out set to failure, we move to the next exercise. But that might look like 4 sets to another person. If it got a back off set on like a chest press or whatever, we call it 2 sets. We wouldn't call it 5.
Yeah. Yeah. No, the feeder sets don't count.
No.
Yeah.
And
No.
so when you would look at his stuff, people always said John trained high volume. We would always have those conversations after training sessions, and John would be like, "How many sets did you call that?" And I would think in my head, I'd be like, 4. And he'd go, I would say 5, but that's about right. And that would
Yeah.
be for like, and we'd be so sore. We did a leg workouts on his YouTube channel. The one in Vegas, me and him and Chase. We did a leg workout in Vegas. I couldn't walk right for 4 days after. And it was like we did a couple of high rep sets of leg extensions, which John liked to do that stuff. I hated that. But we did a couple of high rep sets of leg extensions. We did 1 cluster on hacks. We did a swing squat set after that, and then that was it.
Yeah. Well, like you said, you did.
Bro, we were just different. Now it is different when you're training with your buddies because you go way harder.
Yeah.
So, but like I remember, man, we were trying to walk through. I was trying to walk through the mall like the next day, and like I was walking downstairs. You ever get that knee buckle when your legs are so sore?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like that. And whenever we trained, like it was like that. And we'd always laugh and say, John would say, everybody thinks I train with all this volume. We called that leg exercise. That leg session was like 4 sets.
Yeah. Like you said, you've done 4 sets. I've had quad workouts where I literally done 2, 3 sets and like
And
it's it. But I've had other quad workouts where I could do, 8, 9 sets and it's that's it. But
that's what I said earlier. I was like, nobody, in my opinion, is really training to failure. They don't. Not only can they probably not do 9 sets, but they can't do 9 quality sets. But the other thing is they don't need that many.
I hope you're enjoying today's episode of the podcast. Hopefully you are, and if you are, make sure that you like this video and make sure that you are subscribed to the channel here. That is important, and I really appreciate all the support from you guys. I've been getting a lot of great feedback regarding the podcast, so I'm going to keep trying to push out a new episode every week for you guys. So if there's anybody that you specifically want me to bring on, I know a lot of people wanted me to get Paul on, and I did, and it's been great talking with him. Super smart guy, and I'm definitely going to have him back on again in the future. It's funny because I had to listen to this whole podcast and replay it while I was editing it. And even though we covered so much in it over this 2.5 hour episode, there's still so much more that we could have covered. And there's just a lot of nuance and so many variables that go into a lot of the topics that we discussed, which we said multiple times. But, as I'm listening to it, playing it back, all these light bulbs kept going off, and I kept realizing, I should have brought this up, or I should have asked about this or said that, which could have led into an entirely different conversation. But obviously, while I'm in the midst of conversation, I'm not thinking of every single scenario or circumstance or variable that might lead into a whole nother conversation or change the answer dependent on that context. So there's just a lot that goes into all of this stuff. So yeah, I'll definitely have Paul on again in the future, and we could get into even more than we got into now, because it really never ends, guys. But yeah, like I was saying, if there's anybody else you want me to bring on, just let me know in the comments, drop a comment, and I'll see what I can do. But real quick, what I really want to talk about is health supplementation, and this is important, so listen up. Now, some of you may already know that I am an athlete for both Raw and Revive, as both of those companies are kind of like intertwined, right? And Raw covers most of your basic gym supplements, right? You know, the products you think of when you just hear, you know, what supplements are in your gym bag. So that would be things like protein powders, whether it's whey isolate or vegan protein, creatine, amino acids, pump products, pre-workouts, all that good stuff. And all of their products are great. I love all of them. I love Savage. Right here, my favorite pre-workout by far. This is 3-peat, but I love Dragon Fruit the most. I recommend it to everybody. And we did just release a new pre-workout as well called Essential. I haven't had a chance to try it yet because I haven't been training, but it's gotten nothing but great feedback. People seem to love it, and it's cheaper compared to the other pre's because we narrowed it down just to the essential ingredients, hence the name. Now, I just want to say that I've had numerous opportunities to work with various supplement companies, especially this past year when I went through prep. A lot of companies were emailing me, messaging me, wanting to work with me and sign with me, and I pretty much ignored all of them for a long time simply because a lot of the brands did not, most of them, pretty much all of them, did not align with my values, and integrity is something that is extremely important to me. It's not about just being with any brand just to have a sponsor, and that's what a lot of people seem to only care about. You know, they as long as you're giving me free stuff and I can make some money, then what does it really matter? And that's just not how I ever viewed working with the company. And the difference with Raw and Revive, and one of the biggest reasons why I really signed with Raw and Revive to begin with, was actually because of all the health supplementation that Revive offers, which is something that 99% of other brands do not. At the end of the day, they just don't even cover it. And with me being a competitive bodybuilder and a full-time coach, you know, looking after clients, being with a brand that offers these various products specifically catered towards internal health, taking care of all that, it's huge to me. And it's something that is extremely overlooked in the fitness community, and it shouldn't be. When it comes to supplementation, the vast majority of people seem to be hyper fixated on products that typically just help with performance, like pre-workouts, all that good stuff, you know, the basic gym supplements that we mentioned earlier, which can be great. There's nothing wrong with that, but people often overlook the health aspect of it. For whatever reason, they feel like it's not worth the investment. I think this is really just due to the fact that with health supplementation, you're not using products that you may necessarily feel, right? Like with the pre-workout, you feel amped up, you know it's working or whatever. But I mean, even with protein, you wouldn't feel it. But I just think people don't realize, like, you're not going to feel your liver cleanse. You're not going to feel like this crazy healthy individual when you use health products, but that's not the point. The point is to keep yourself healthy, which could translate into a million different things. But people fail to realize that if you are not functioning well internally, that can directly affect the progress that you're able to make externally, if that makes sense. And this especially applies when it comes to things like gut health. You know, you see tons of guys that can't put their food down for shit. They constantly say they feel lethargic, they're bloated, they aren't digesting their food that well. This is something that is extremely common in bodybuilding, especially in an off season, and most of the time, guys will just ignore this and continue to wreak havoc on their digestive system, which will 100%, you know, directly affect the progress that you're able to make in an off season or in a bulking phase. But guys just have that meathead mentality where they're like, you're supposed to feel like shit all the time, get used to it, whatever, and that is just not necessarily true. You need to be optimizing digestion, prioritizing gut health along with everything else, liver health, kidney health, managing lipid profiles, supplementing with vitamins and minerals that you might be deficient in if you want to just be a healthy individual and have longevity, which is another thing that people fail to realize, is that bodybuilding is about longevity. This is not a healthy sport, no matter how perfect your diet is, and especially if you're on fucking PEDs. I mean, if you're on gear and you aren't already taking proper health supplementation, you are literally just asking for problems down the road. This is not something you should be taking lightly. Now, obviously, getting routine lab work and checking health markers is important first and foremost to see if there's anything that could be better, and that way you can address those issues properly, and you should really do that whether you are enhanced or not. But like I said, if you are enhanced, you should be using proper health supplementation from the get-go with or without blood work, because it is always better to be safe than sorry. Anyways, yeah, so that is a huge reason why I signed with Raw and Revive, is to be with a brand that prioritizes health and also holds their products to the highest standard at the end of the day. Some of you may already know this, but the supplement industry is a very shady place. A lot of the stuff isn't regulated. Many brands do not go through proper testing with their products, They beat around the bush, and what you end up with is a lot of products from all these random brands that are actually underdosed. And in some cases, it's literally not even the actual supplement that you think you're getting. I've seen this numerous times with Yohimbe and HCl specifically. It's just been bunk. It's not even fucking Yohimbe and HCl. But rest assured, with Revive, all products do go through proper testing, so you always do know what you're getting. You don't have to second guess it. They are very well formulated, and a lot of them are with the help of Alan Kress. And if you don't know who that is, I suggest you look him up. He's a super smart guy, if not one of the smartest guys in this industry. But yeah, sorry for my little rant here. I just wanted to touch on the importance of health supplementation. Not even really make this like an ad about Raw and Revive. Use my code SEB, which I will put up there anyways. But I wanted to stress the importance of health supplementation because I can't do it enough. Not enough people talk about this. It's rarely talked about. And I can tell you that using a lot of these products has helped me tremendously. And at this point, I've had quite a few clients who have had significant improvements in health markers after implementing some of these products. You know, to getting labs before and a couple months after, we have seen significant improvements within that with quite a few guys. And I've had a lot more guys also have huge improvements in their digestion and their ability to push food after implementing some of these gut health products as well. And I'm going to give you a pointer here right now because if you're not doing this already, I'm going to tell you to do it right now because this is what I recommend everybody to do first and foremost for gut health if you're not doing this already. And that would be taking 10 grams of glutamine every morning, fasted on an empty stomach before you eat your first meal. So like 15 minutes before, could be earlier. Everybody should be doing that. I got that from Phil Viz. I'll credit him. I got that years ago from him. It helped me tremendously. It's something I recommend to everybody. It's just something you should be doing. It's not expensive to do, and it can help you a lot. So drink that with like 20 ounces of water before you have your first meal in the morning. If you're not doing that already, just start doing it. Trust me. And with all of that being said, if you do decide to order any products from Raw or Revive, make sure you always use code SEB, and that'll save you some money. Because why spend more when you could spend less with code SEB? All right, I'm done now. I'll let you guys get back to the podcast. Sorry for the rant. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the volume and the frequency thing.
Okay.
So you say they don't need 9 sets, but I think there's a difference between what people might need minimally, like to get away with, and what you could get away with the most and maybe get more out of that. Yes or no?
I think there's like yes, I think there's a range. That's why we have a range, right, for volume.
And what
And so
everybody needs might be different.
I think that, yeah, there's going to be some people that can recover a little bit better. There's going to be some people that may respond a little bit better to a little more volume, but I think it's all going to be within a very close range, which is why
Yeah.
we end up back in those very same ranges over the course of a couple of decades of looking at volume tiers. What it always comes back to is this, and this only, is that the longer rest periods that you have between sets, the less volume that you need to reach that threshold for maximizing the muscle protein synthesis response. That's a fact, not a debate. Like you, so here's what happens when you look at the methodologies in research and studies. Every time they use longer rest periods, you will see in longitudinal hypertrophy studies, you will see that the low and mid volume tiers always outperform the high volume tiers. So that means they were meeting that threshold needed for volume, right, to maximize muscle protein synthesis with much less volume than you would think.
Yeah.
Time they do a methodology where they use short rest periods, where it's 60 or 90 seconds, the highest volume tiers have the most hypertrophy. But that is because when you use shorter rest periods, you end up with more central fatigue in the subsequent sets. So then in those subsequent sets, you recruit fewer motor units, which means it takes you more sets, more sets to end up basically to hit that threshold, right? Of like needed for maximizing muscle protein synthesis because fewer muscle fibers are active in the subsequent sets. So
Yeah, well, this is why, 10 years ago, everybody was doing 45, 60-second rest, higher volume, do 5 sets per workout because.
So when you look at those, that's something they don't like to talk about, but this is very, very clear in the data. When you do short rest periods, the higher volume tiers are going to show more hypertrophy. It's not, and that led people over the years to go, oh, see, you got to do a bunch of volume to get to, no, you just need to rest longer and then you'll get the same results with less sets. So that's why, and I made that post before when people were like, I ain't resting 3 minutes when he says I'd be in the gym for 3 hours. I'm like, no, you just do half the amount of volume and you'd be in the gym the same amount of time.
Yeah.
That's it. Like you just do half the volume. So when you look at something, even like going back to the Ostrowski study, which is kind of a landmark study for longitudinal hypertrophy research, because they used a bro split and he did 3 volume tiers, and the middle volume tier was the best one.
Mm-hmm.
and usually long rest periods. And nobody's ever been able to. I remember, I think it was, I can't remember who it was, broke down why didn't some of these high volume studies, why did they need like four times the amount of volume that Ostrowski got in like half the volume? I'm like, because he used the methodology he used was long rest periods. So the amount of volume that you remember, like once you reach that threshold for maximizing whether it's like mixed protein synthesis or myofibril protein synthesis for that muscle group, more volume is not doing anything. It doesn't continue to increase that.
Okay, so how do we know how much volume you need necessarily
So that's what we use progressive overload for.
to see if you're progressing? Yeah.
So if you go in, I always tell people start at the minimum amount, something like 3 sets a week for a muscle group.
3 sets a
And
week.
mm,
This is like a beginner, though.
no,
Really?
could be,
Okay. Guess could be me.
yeah. So what if I like if let's say you were doing whatever and I started doing your training and we pulled you back to where you were doing 3 sets of bicep training a week, and then all of a sudden you saw your progressive overload go through the roof and your biceps got bigger. Well, that just means you're recovering better, right? So like it all depends on the muscle group too and how much muscle damage, how susceptible they are to muscle damage. But that's a completely different conversation. But I tell people you have to start somewhere, and it's better to start with the least amount than start with a whole bunch and have to pare back. That doesn't make any damn sense at all.
Hmm.
Like I was doing 10 sets for each muscle. Like if it's not working, what do I do? Do I go up from there? That's ridiculous.
Yeah, no.
If I start at 2 or 3 sets a week, that's what I want to do. Or if 2 sets or 3 sets, say twice a week, which is 4 to 6 sets a week, whichever one you want to do. Start at the minimum amount. And then if you're seeing progressive overload occur, don't increase it. Well, why would you increase it if you're consistently breaking rep PRs and adding load? Why would you increase it? That doesn't make sense. So if you hit a plateau, I always have a way. People's like, well, how do I know when to change a lift, or how would I know what to do when I hit a plateau? Well, if you started like a smart person on the lower end of the volume tier like that, you can add a set then. So then if you add a set at that point and progressive overload continues to occur, then you knew you just needed a little more volume to get past that plateau.
Okay.
But otherwise, if you hit a plateau, where do you start rescaling? So you need to scale going up to where you plateau off. And then say if a lift stalls, at that point, it may just be a thing where you've maxed out your particular muscle growth for that muscle at that joint angle range of motion or with that lift, and you need to change something. But the point is, you don't start with a whole bunch of volume. The whole point is you start with the least amount that you're getting results from and then increase it minimally from there as you need it. The other thing you do is like once you add that 1 set in, if that doesn't work, increase the rest days between when you train that muscle.
Hmm.
So either one of those work, then it's probably just time to just change exercises. So
So you think it's
I
important to stick to a certain program, stick to these exercises, focus on progressively overloading on all of them, and be like regimented with that?
yes,
So then what about the guys? Because there's plenty of, fucking pro bodybuilders. I know, they're all on gear, but just go into the gym and wing it, right? Auto regulate. I want to do this. I want to do this movement today. I'm just going to go to failure on it. As long as I'm pushing failure, I'm still experiencing that mechanical tension, right? So why does it really
well,
matter?
yeah, I think that's when you're talking about like guys that are pro bodybuilders and like are what I call like hyper responders to androgens, that's a really bad anecdote because yeah, I mean we have research that shows even guys that are not hyper responders that are the first time users, you just inject them with a super maximal dose of testosterone and they'll grow muscle sitting around at home. So if you take a guy that's a hyper responder, yeah, it's that's one of the worst things about using pro bodybuilders at times as an anecdote. It's like you take a hyper responder, and John and I were friends, and I knew what he did. Like he could take one time when we were in Australia, he did a whole vial of equipoise over the course of the week,
What the
and
fuck?
person 5 days later because he was a hyper responder. But he would tell you that he was. So
Yeah.
that was what he was. But John didn't use big cycles. That was a case where he needed to go through that vial before he left the country.
Yeah.
So, but the point he said, he looked at it, he said, by the end of this week, my chest is going to look like two, it's going to be twice the size it is right now. And it was.
Yeah.
So when you talk about pro bodybuilders who are hyper responders, and people like talk about stuff that we don't have any proof of, like androgen receptors and all this kind of stuff. And either way, we know they're hyper responders because they can take 400 milligrams of test like Kevin Levrone did and blow up and be 245 pounds, like shredded, when he was 205 pounds 2 months prior to that, right? Like
Yeah.
they're so those kind of guys, I think, are poor examples to use in those
Well, not
terms.
even not even using like their physique, just that concept in general. If I go to the gym, anybody goes to the gym, and as long as they're just doing, random movements, they like to switch things up, but they're still pushing to failure. They're still experiencing that. What does it matter if they're tracking progressive overload?
Well, because there's going to be adaptations that are going to occur from doing that movement over and over again that you're not going to get if you're just changing stuff up week to week to week to week to week. So if you take a guy that, let's go in, he's just doing, like, say, a machine chest press, right? And he's stimulating those fibers, that joint angle range of motion. And then the next week so he gets some stimulus from that. The next week he goes, yeah, I'm going to do a decline press, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that. Well, over time, if he hasn't progressively overloaded those lifts, in a way, he's kind of handicapped himself, because it's going to take more adaptations to go from, say, a 315 bench to a 500 bench, right? That's what you're basing it off of. So if you don't spend time repeating that lift and getting those adaptations over and over and over again, then no, you're not going to end up with as like that same level foundational size of muscle mass if you're just somebody going in and changing lifts every single week. So take a guy that responds really well, like we talked about earlier, to squats. Take a guy like Tom Platz. What if Tom Platz didn't spend years doing 20 rep squats? He didn't need 20 reps. But if he didn't spend years squatting, he was built for squatting. He got a great stimulus out of squatting. But let's say he just squatted one week and did some leg press the next week, then did some hacks the next week, and did some of this and he did some of that. I think a big part of why Tom had those massive adductors and quads that he had is because he went in and squatted every single week. He was built for squatting. So I
Yeah.
think you find the lifts that you're structurally sound and built for, that work for you, and you progressively overload them over a long period of time to where you're moving loads. Like Ronnie Coleman repeated most of his workouts. Like you look at like his workouts, like he was picking the same big basic lifts over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Well, was Ronnie benching? What was he benching? 500 for five, and I hate using Ronnie during those kind of things. But if we're talking like for like even pro bodybuilders, I think for the most part, every guy is going to benefit more by finding a set of lifts he like is structurally built to do that doesn't get any problems, and progressively overload those over a long period of time. And that's where you're going to get the greatest amount of those adaptations.
Yeah.
That can lead to a whole different conversation about muscle links and how we get adaptations both longitudinally.
Well, the way
And
that I typically set it up, and the way that I see a lot of guys set it up is I'll have like staple movements that I stick to. So, let's say I do chest, I want to stick to Smith machine incline or incline dumbbell forever this X amount of time. I have like the couple staple movements, but then I also go to a gym that has a bunch of different machines. So one day I might do a seated cable press, or I might do the chest press machine. So having a little variation within that. Now, would you say that's something that's necessarily bad, or should I just solely just stick to one and focus on that? Because at
I,
that point in the workout, I'm already, just doing like,
I think that you need some consistent go-tos, right? I have those, and that's why we talk about like the four exercises. It's a four in a workout, right? But I told you I have a rotation, so it ends up being a multitude of exercises done over the course of the rotation.
yeah.
But I have the same ones that I do. So over the course of the rotation, like say chest will still get one, two, three, four or five different exercises. That's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So delts will get that many, triceps will get that many, but it's over the course of rotation. But for the most part, I have at least I have like a core set of lifts I still enjoy doing that I focus on. I want to continuously overload these. And then the same thing, I think that I have some I rotate through because there's certain muscles I just don't really like training, like biceps. I can tell you when's the last time I repeated a multitude of like of a curl like for any length of time because I hate training biceps.
Right. I
So
love training biceps.
I hate training. So, but you probably have some bicep exercises that you really enjoy doing over and over again, right?
Yeah.
There you go. So I hate training biceps. So I don't. I have like a couple that I'll go. I like to find the laziest setup possible that I can just do some curls on and then leave the gym.
Yeah.
So, but I like think about it this way. there's regional hypertrophy that happens with both stressing muscles at different joint angle ranges of motions, different resistance profiles, different muscle links, and all that kind of stuff. So if you want basically what I'd consider to maximize your development, then over a long period of time, you do need to progressively overload at using certain resistance profiles, certain muscle length, certain movements, stuff like that. So if you're just consistently going in and changing a multitude of muscle like basically motions all the time and you're not progressively overloaded, you don't end up with the maximum amount of adaptations regionally that's going to happen in the muscle. For example, I mean, we know this certain movements, depending on the resistance profile, depending on the exercise, the motion, the muscle length, all of those things cause regional hypertrophy, which means it could be distal or proximal. It's going to be in different places within the muscle. And longer muscle lengths always tend to produce more distal hypertrophy because there's some more sarcomeres in a series. So if you never use progressively overload specific long muscle length movements for specific muscles, then you don't end up with that more distal hypertrophy, that regional hypertrophy. If you don't overload certain mid-range and short position movements, then you don't end up with more of that proximal hypertrophy in certain regions. So it is important to repeat certain patterns and overload those to end up maximizing the amount of adaptations you're going to have from a muscular perspective.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So with that being said, having these adaptations, this brings into the question of frequency, because people say, the push pull legs, you're doing something more frequently. You have those adaptations quicker, but the adaptation is relative to the splits that you do. You adapt at that rate. So what does that matter? We know that the split doesn't matter as long as total volume is equated for. So let's get into that a bit here. The push pull legs, the bro split. I know you just recently you did a bro split for your app, your training thing, the Garage
Yeah,
Gangsters, or is it Yoke Squad?
like it's been so much fun because they've just been crushing things, and I'm just like, okay, like I'm not surprised because I've used bro splits most of my life. I mean, I've used push pull legs, I've used like some upper lower stuff, but basically all of the research consistently comes back and shows that every once in a while there'll be that stray research that shows like twice a week is better. But like for example, this is a good one. Biceps could have consistently show when they're trained less, they grow more. So and there'll be always be something to do with anecdotes. Well, my biceps grew the most when I train them every day, like CT Fletcher. And I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. Like consistently over and over again, what we see out of the data is when you're training biceps. I think there was one that showed 6 days a week, and there was a loss in muscle size. And then when they pulled it down to 3 days a week, 3 days was better than I think it was. I'd have to remember. 2 days was better than three, and one day was better than two. And that falls in line with the modeling that we understand about how muscle damage occurs and which muscles are most susceptible to muscle damage. So not all muscles recover um, from muscle damage. Both some are more susceptible and are more easily damaged, and so they recover slower. So it really, when we look at the volume equated stuff, and this comes back to what we just talked about, when you have longer rest periods, you don't need as much volume to maximize the muscle protein synthesis or to get the maximum amount of adaptations you're going to get. So they would say the argument would be all of these arguments fall flat on their face when you actually understand how to put the data together. They would say, well, doing training a muscle more times in the week allows me to use more volume, and more volume is needed to maximize the muscle growth. And I'm like, actually, we understand the threshold to be met to maximize muscle protein synthesis is far less than what you think it is, which means the amount of volume that you need is probably far less than what you think it is, which means that's why every time they use a bro split and they equate the volume compared to twice a week or 3 times a week, the results are basically the similar. So they don't have a way to argue themselves out. The one they'll come up is like, well, if I stimulate a muscle multiple times a week, doesn't that mean I'm like, well, not if a muscle is damaged because it still has to go through the repair process. Your muscle is not going, if you train it and it's going and it's already damaged from the previous workout, it's not going to add more new contractile proteins while it still needs to repair from the previous one.
Well, people
So
will argue that when you do a bro split, that since you're equating the total volume, that it's too much within a given session. And obviously, they may not need that much, but also this comes back to the fact that everybody has different requirements for like what they could tolerate, how much volume they do. Like I could do a working 10 to 11 working sets on chest in a bro split on if I have one chest day a week and be completely fine. I don't think there's an issue with that necessarily.
I don't think that you're probably getting anything more. I think if you paired that back even to like six, like I don't think you would see anything different. So I think that's what I'm saying is like I don't think that's why I said I think the volume is going to be far less than people actually realize. So if you did six sets this week, and you could always try it and like get back to me, and I think it'll basically end up turning out like what I'm telling you. And if you do six sets, say comparatively to 10 or 11, and you even do that once a week, I think that you'll see basically this if you're actually progressively overloading as far as tracking, I think that you'll see either better or the same happen.
Okay, yeah. But do you think there's an adaptation that occurs since I'm used to training? Like when I started training, like I'm sure you did before, it was like all high volume, right? Super high volume. I used to do fucking five
I
sets. You never did that.
Nope.
Okay, I was a part of that. But
Dorian, I tell you, Dorian was my guy, like right out of the gate. So most of what when I started training Dorian, that was when he was really coming onto the scene, and I thought Dorian had a thinking man's approach behind training and his approach to training, and that's what I gravitated toward. I never did. Whenever I would read Arnold shit, it never made sense to me. Like, why did I need 25 sets for chest? I saw a thing with Lee Priest on the other day, and it didn't make any damn sense to me. It showed like a complete like gap in knowledge, and he tried to compare stuff like, well, like I can't remember. I think he was bicyclist and all these other people who spent or MMA guys who spent like 6 to 8 hours,
yeah,
like training. And he's like, when you think you're going to train 45 minutes a day and like build maximum amount of muscle, I'm like, yeah, we have like, I don't know, decades of like research that actually shows that. So I never got into the whole like the Arnold bullshit of I need to train twice a day or I'm going to do like 20 sets for this muscle. I did actually do that one summer and it was the worst results I ever had.
yeah. Well, what I'm saying is that I grew up training that way. So now me doing like 10 working sets feels like very low volume to me for my perception of
I
what was.
compared it back to six, you would see better results. 6 to 8.
But then we also talked about, if you start lower, you might plateau, then you would benefit from increasing volume. No?
So how much? So how do you know if you haven't started at the lowest tier and slowly increase volume? How do you know that it's 11 sets or 12 sets? And that's why I tell people when you're at those higher and you come down, how do you know where like the greatest amount is for you to be using for yourself if you haven't started from the lowest? Because if progressive overload is not occurring, adaptations are not occurring.
Well, yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, like I told you, like, I auto regulate the training. So one day it might be less, one day it might be, around that 10 to 12 mark. I'm always I'm always going, I'm like, given I'm also fucking enhanced. This changes a lot of factors apparently, but
I mean,
I
that's the other thing is what we were talking about. So when you're enhanced, the recovery process really is happening peripherally. So you end up kind of bypassing a lot of that. So muscle protein synthesis is basically turned on 24/7 when you're enhanced. So
yeah,
you don't have that without like you don't basically don't end up you kind of negate that big process that natural guys have to go through where they experience muscle damage where the muscle damage has to be repaired recovered from mixed muscle protein synthesis and maybe they do or don't get a certain amount of a new like new hypertrophy that occurs so there's that like there's once you go enhancing it does change the game a bit but I've always said and I'll always say this I think whatever you figure out works really well for you as a natural just works infinitely better once you get on. I didn't change anything in my training once I got on and it just worked better.
yeah. People always say that you can't train like that if you're, natural or if you're
I
this is
don't
enhanced.
if you're a natural guy you figure out how to train and eat those two things in a way that's very productive for you and once you get on you don't change it you
Yeah.
you just work its magic. And that is something that I think is completely misconstrued by the natty community. And I was natty for 20 years. So none of them natties guys could say shit to me. I was 255 pounds as a natty. So once you figure out how to train as a natty, everything you're doing as a natty that works just works infinitely better once you're on gear.
Well, they don't have that perception because they've never taken gear. When you have both sides of the spectrum,
The process that you take gear and that here's I guess my point about it is that you take gear, and then the key is then you can do this inordinate amount of like volume, and that you're going to constantly recover isn't necessarily true, or that it's beneficial. What it is, it just makes everything else that you're doing so much better, because of the fact that you basically you can see the peripheral fatigue recovery happen at that level. However, all the other factors are still involved. So this is my concept that I use, and I've done this with tons of people who went from being natty to being enhanced, is that I didn't change anything, and then once they go enhanced, everything just worked amazing. And like I've even known that from certain guys that didn't see progressive overload occur. So this is sometimes an anecdotal, n equals one thing, is that certain guys that were on gear couldn't tolerate a lot of training. They wouldn't see progressive overload occurring, or they'd go backwards. Dorian talked about this actually too, is like when he would try to increase training volume, he would actually see regression occur. And then when he would reduce training volume, it would go up again. So there's probably some things at play there when we're talking about enhanced stuff that we don't know. I mean, it's not like we can go around testing people, doing PubMed shit on people on trend. I don't think we have a single trend study out there
I don't
anyway.
think so. So
So I never bought into the whole thing. It was like once you go get on gear, you change all your training. I never did that. And I didn't do it with clients either. And I trained pro bodybuilders and all this kind of stuff. And nobody ever trained different. I figured out how each person, what their recovery looked like if progressive overload was occurring. That's how you always judge if your training is working. And then you just adjust it from there. But I never found anything where it's like the geared guy could do like so much more. I had some natty guys that could recover better from a little bit more volume than geared guys could.
but that's within like a total week span.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what guys will make the argument for is like I know you said you may not need this much volume, but I could do 10 sets, let's say, in a work. Like you don't do you think you could do 10 working sets in a workout and be effective? It's not like black and white for everybody. Like there's people can do that, right?
I think you can do 10 sets to failure. I don't think that you can do 10 sets to failure and that you're getting anything out of that that you didn't get out of 6 to 8.
Okay. So but people will make the argument regardless of that and say you can only do 10 sets because you're on gear. When I don't think that makes any sense.
No, that part doesn't make sense. I think when I was at Natty, like, and I did, I mean, I've done some like ball busting workouts. Like, I don't know that like that doesn't. That's not. I don't think that's the argument. I think that you can probably recover, like from like as far as like muscle damage goes, you're going to recover better than a natty guy does, right? Like that's going to happen, like at the peripheral level. So the central fatigue, like that doesn't have shit to do with gear. A lot of guys don't. When I said they don't
Yeah.
understand, you nothing changes as
They
far
think
as
you're
that.
just like a superhuman. Like I fucking could do 20 reps on a squat and I'm no failure, no fatigue. Like I could do another fucking 5 sets.
Yeah, the central fatigue thing has nothing to do with gear. The peripheral fatigue thing does have to do with gear. So but you being like doing 10 sets like a natty guy could do, there's some natty guys out there who do tons of volume, and I always think, well, I thought the gear guys were supposed to recover more, but uh a lot of people make the argument that guys on gear can get away with doing less because muscle protein synthesis is turned on all the time, so there you don't need as much. So I would actually err on the side that that's probably truer than the whole you can do more and get away with it.
So then they can make the argument for that having more frequency would make more sense if you were enhanced in that case.
I think that um, there's so many like nuanced moving pieces here as far as
Yeah.
like natty enhanced thing. And here's the thing: at the end of the day, remember this: the enhanced argument doesn't have data. It's
Oh,
always just it doesn't. So I don't really, and because I've been off gear for 8 years, I don't like read into any of that stuff. I don't go out to like when I was powerlifting and I took gear, like I wanted to know, like, okay, what do I need to do for gear? And like we have to go and talk to other people right there on message boards or other guys that use gear. But I don't use gear anymore, so I don't really read about gear. And we don't have a bunch of studies where we look at what's happening. We had that one really well done study. We looked at 4 groups, like one group that didn't train that was on gear, one group that did train on gear, and then I think it was one group that didn't train. There's a control group that didn't train and not on gear, and then the natty group that trained and not on gear. And we, outside of that, as far as I know, we don't have a bunch of studies that look at gear. So I don't think there's any way. That's why I think when people talk about, well, this guy's natty, this guy's natty, well, all of the studies that we look at are on dudes that are natural. So
Yeah.
those are applicable. But that's why when guys are like, yeah, but that's not for natty guys, I'm like, who do you think these studies are done on? So when they talk about the training volume and frequency stuff, I'm like, these are all natural dudes, and they'll be like, well, I don't know any natural champions to train like that. And this is something that comes back to full circle that we talked about earlier. There are certain ideologies that have been spread around for a long time now, especially by the natty community, that no matter how much data comes out, they won't shift. And one is they need a whole bunch of volume. The other is they got to train a whole bunch of times a week, blah, 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 blah. And no matter how much data comes out, they refuse to budge from those stances. So this is what we know. You don't need as much volume as you think you do. That there's a threshold for volume. That volume does help increase hypertrophy outcomes, but only to a point. Once that threshold is reached, doing more doesn't do anything. We know that. That's not even up for like. There's some people that maybe need a little more, or some people can get away with a little less, but it's within a range. And like an outlier is 8 sets in a workout. An outlier is 8 to 10 sets in a workout.
That they
That's
would
the out.
need, that they would need.
Yes. So it's far less than they think it is. And I don't mean this is one study or two. This is a lot. It's a lot of this is like when you look across all the research. So we know that. We know that when you match those lower medium tiers of volume and they're matched across the training week for frequency, 1 time, 2 time, or 3 times, the results are pretty much the same. So that is what has been repeatable. So when you look at data and science and all this stuff, you need models and you need repeatable data. Well, when you get repeatable outcomes over and over and over and over again, after a while, you'd be like, well, it's time to move the goalposts to shift your thinking a little bit because I don't know what you're still clinging to. But you can't tell me you don't still hear from it's mainly the natty guys that you need to train a muscle group twice a week and then that's more effective. And
Yeah.
I'm like,
No.
hear it all the time. I'm like, well, can you show me the can you show me because the meta analysis doesn't say that.
They just make the argument that muscle protein synthesis lasts 72 hours or whatever.
Right. And this is what I think actually happens. This is why I think the outcomes are what they are. I think that you get the the adaptations, the hypertrophy adaptations are still after the 72 hours. So you have the muscle protein synthesis that increases. I think they stay, they don't decrease as fast as like the atrophy doesn't outrun the adaptations over the course of those 6 days.
Yeah. No.
That makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, we see it with all the guys that ran bro splits naturally. I mean, it's anecdotal, but you could just see all these guys obviously have made significant progress. All the guys you have in your program, like it's very clear.
I don't have I'm sure there's some people in my programs that run gear, but I got thousands that don't
Yeah.
that that absolutely have amazing transformations. And we've done bro splits, we've done twice. I've never done 3 times a week. There's no freaking point ever in training a muscle group 3 times a week. That's ridiculous.
What do you think about? I mean, this is like pretty irrelevant, but I just want to get your opinion. What do you think about like the bikini girls who hit legs 3 times a week, but they have prioritized hamstring, glute, and quad days?
I think if you're going to train a muscle group like 3 times a week, so I have to back up on the statement because we in some of my groups we train glutes 3 times a week because women believe that they believe that you have to do that. So you can do it, but you have to know how to do it.
Yeah.
And people don't know how to do that. So if you train a muscle in shorter positions, you can do it. If you're, in other words, if you're going to do more volume and more frequency, then you need to stick to more shorter position movements where you're going to incur less peripheral fatigue.
Okay. Okay.
So there's less muscle damage that occurs.
Okay.
So like if you're doing short position movements, say on Monday for glutes, you can do short position movements on Monday, Wednesday, and then Friday rolls around, boom, do your RDLs, do your squats, do your leg presses, do that stuff. Those are longer position movements that cause more damage, and then you have more time to recover. So you take 2 or 3 days off before you go back to your short position movements. So I have to quantify those statements because somebody would be like, but you got groups where I'm like, let me quantify that and say there's now at the same time, I'll say this. A lot of time I do that because you get people like a lot like you talked about earlier, you've been basically indoctrinated to believe that you have to learn how to squat, otherwise you don't know. Like you just like you have to learn how to squat. And you're like, I think there's something to be said for learning how to squat. And I'll be like, well,
Yeah,
what?
it's like like when you get introduced to math, like you got to learn how to add. It just seems like one of those things that are like a staple of learning how to train. You should know
And
how to squat.
women have been indoctrinated by a lot of these booty dudes to believe have to train glutes 3 times a week. I
Yeah.
believe that indoctrinated in that. So I'm like, all right. So one of my programs, I make sure a good portion of the time we're training glutes 3 times a week, but I know how to program it so that they aren't going to end up basically what a lot of people call overtraining. But you can train a muscle multiple times a week. Something like glutes, especially low degrees of voluntary activation, it's not an easily damaged muscle group, so you can train it more often. But you still want to make sure and not do a bunch of long muscle link movements if you're going to
Yeah.
train a muscle more often.
Yeah. We're talking about training muscle groups more often. Now, obviously, it's different for everybody. There's genetic variants and whatnot. Do you think certain muscle groups necessarily might need more volume? So whether that's more frequency within a session, well, if you do so much volume within a session, there's going to be a point of diminishing returns. But people will say this with forearms, but more specifically with calves. Some guys have really stubborn calves. Just having a much higher, frequency, more volume.
Abs, abs are different because they have a very weird tension relationship. So they don't actually benefit at all from like the shortened position. So that top of the calf raise doesn't do anything.
Yeah, so I do a lot of loaded stretches for calves.
That's pretty much all you can really do for the most part. It's like, so you hold the stretch position for 3 to 5 seconds. So you're going to do loaded stretching for calves, and that's almost. There's actually a study that looked at bedridden people that used a leg press, and the whole time they were in plantar flexion, right? So their calf is shortened the whole time, and their calf continued to atrophy for the whole month they were using this leg press. So in the shortened position, the calves experience no tension. So like that top of the calf raise, but you're getting back to training a muscle multiple times a week. So that it's not that they benefit more from it. It's that they're less susceptible to damage. Those are
Because
two.
they're so frequently used.
No, it's not about how frequently they're used. It's about a multitude of factors. It's about, for example, it'll be like how susceptible they are to muscle damage, how easily they're activated, their fiber type distribution, um, what kind of movements that you're using. So there's a lot of factors that go into like if a muscle is easily damaged, the length to tension relationship. So muscles that tend to have that tend to have a length to tension relationship where they benefit from a lot of stretch mediated hypertrophy can be more easily damaged. However, they can have a fiber type distribution that offsets that particular factor. So there's a lot that's if a muscle can be trained more often, which is why I won't get into those conversations online, is like a multitude of nuance factors.
Okay. Yeah, because it would be very hard to say that on TikTok. But so, do you think calves are one of those muscles?
Yes, yes. Calves are one of those muscles because they have well, like for example, the soleus is like mostly slow twitch. Like it's like 90% slow twitch fiber type distribution. So slow twitch fibers, type 1 fibers have very high mitochondrial density, so they're not easily damaged. So something like but I think the gastroc is actually, despite the fact that people say it's slow twitch, it's like a 50-50 distribution. So, but their link attention relationship is that it sits mainly, the working sarcomere link is mainly on just almost only on the ascending limb and barely even gets to the plateau, which means it's got a lot of sarcomeres in a series, which means the only way it can actually experience any real tension is in that stretch. So you can train the calves will be pretty good at offsetting muscle damage. So you can train them more often.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you from experience. Do you know who Jonathan Withers is?
Who?
Jonathan Withers. He's a pro bodybuilder. Okay, so he used to train at my gym in Armbrust, and I, was talking to him one day, asked him how his calves are fucking massive. It's huge, it's huge. He said he trains them 3 days on, 1 day off, 3 days on, 1 day off, year round, consistently. So I did this for 2 months, and within a month and a half, that is the most growth I ever experienced anecdotally in my calves from doing them 3 days on, 1 day off, just nonstop.
John told me to do the same thing. John told me to what finally blew up his calves was training them. I think he did something similar. It was like 5 days a week that he
Yeah.
trained. He'd only go in and do like 2 sets to failure or something, but it was every single workout.
Mm-hmm.
And then he would do a lot of stretching, but he'd do anterior tib work. So it was the same thing. It's like I think the calves. I don't think calves, quote unquote, like are genetic. I think what happens is calves are a unique muscle in that they can be trained more often and have to be trained a specific way. I think that's the issue. I don't think it's that the calves won't grow. I think they don't grow um, the way that other muscles grow to dynamic repetition, stuff
Well, you
like
just said
that.
they're not genetic, but there's some guys that don't even have to trade them and they're fucking massive.
Well, that's what any like. There's some dudes that have that with almost any muscle group, though, too.
Well, yeah, but so that all comes down to genetics, though. No.
And I think I can't remember the joke. It was one time. It's like so basically like any other muscle group. So it's like you run into guys that have always have like that are developed enough have one outstanding body part that maybe they don't put much effort into.
Yeah.
So I don't think the calves. I think the calves are no different as far as that goes. I think there's going to be variances genetically with people and that kind of stuff. Like we all know like that we come across that one guy in the gym that barely does any arm work that has like massive arms, right? And he gets plenty of stimulus from however he's doing like what chins and back work and pressing work. There's always that guy, right? So
Yeah.
like they're going to be the same thing for calves.
Yeah. So then back to the frequency, to the bro split, and all that. You would say doing how much volume you need total weekly in a load, because you said you need less than a lot of people think around like 6 sets or so. So you would set that as the baseline for most people to stick with 6 sets per muscle group.
I think you can start as low as like 3 a week.
Yeah, 3 weeks. That's what you said, right? But then what is the higher rep? Because there's also like individualizing a split. I think people don't really understand how to do that. You have to make up more when you're trying to prioritize something. Like as a bodybuilder, I want to bring my back up. There has to be more volume dedicated toward my back. Maybe I have to split that up over 2 sessions because there's going to be a point of diminishing returns if I'm doing 15 working sets for my back in one workout. So at that point, might make more sense to have 2 back days, more frequency. But then also with that being said, if I want to prioritize my back, the other muscle groups have to have lower volume in relation to that. Obviously, 15 sets per session would be too much. That'd be 30 sets a week. You don't need that. But did you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, so like anytime you're prioritizing, I think the most important thing to understand about prioritizing a muscle is not, again, it comes back to when you're just throwing out a number like sets. I think we have to figure out how many stimulating reps does it need in order to maximize the myofibrin protein synthesis, which is always going to, like I said, going to be less than you think. And then the other thing is just training it first in the workout when you're
Yeah.
fresh. So when you take those two things into account, if you're going to train it twice a week, then I don't think it's a matter of throwing a bunch of volume at it. Like, I don't think that's the answer. I think
Well,
even
in
if
relation to the other body parts, because why would I do 6 sets for back and 6 sets for chest if I want to prioritize bringing up my chest and my chest is my strong point? You know what I mean?
your chest is your strong point, then you can reduce the amount of volume that you're doing for that. Yes, of course. But I think the most important thing will always come back to when you're training it. So you could essentially train chest in the same session that you're doing back, but if you do chest after back, it's going to end up with less stimulus that happens in that workout because of the back work that's preceding it.
Do you think that's one of the benefits of utilizing a bro split? Because one of the things I think is very uh, that a lot of people do wrong in push pull legs is they just well, one, they don't have the rotation, so they usually do the same thing like twice in a row, so the same three workouts, and they're pretty much always just prioritizing chest, back, and maybe like their quads or something. They typically will give less attention to their arms or their shoulders or their calves or their hamstrings. They just get drawn out to the end of the workout.
Well, now you see why I have a 4 exercise selection rule per workout.
Yeah,
The longer the workout goes on and the more sets that are performed, the less effective the workout becomes. So if you're talking about somebody that's using like a push pull legs, those can be very inefficient workouts for the body parts that are worked in the later part of the workout due to the fact that as the workout goes on, you're going to incur more central and peripheral fatigue, and those later sets are just less effective.
yeah,
So if got like lagging triceps and they're always doing chest, shoulders, triceps, and they're doing triceps last, and they've done a bunch of chest work and a bunch of shoulder work because all these teenagers and young 20 dudes that are on TikToks always feel like they need to do so much freaking volume. That's like, I need to do so much, and that's the reason why they're not growing. And I don't, my triceps aren't growing. I'm like, well, you just did 9 sets for chest, and then you did, 8 sets for shoulders. And then by the time you get to triceps, you're not really going to get anything out of that.
yeah. Well, that's why I made
So
when
like a
everybody.
bro, where you're doing 2 body parts in the day, right? Can for somebody who's trying to prioritize something can be far more effective.
Yeah, because you're
But
able to get more effort.
just like again, like that's why when people were like, "How do you only do 4 exercises or whatever?" I'm like, because I have just consistently found people, you just, at least, especially for me, but again, it's back to the research, you just need far less volume than you think you do. So if you're trying to prioritize something, it definitely understanding in the rotation that it's coming early in the week, that you may be having a couple of days off before you train that body part, and then that you're training it first in the session, like those things first, and that you're using movements that really effectively target that tissue. And that's coming back to our squat discussion earlier. That's why, for example, like if you want to train back, I don't recommend doing like a deadlift to train. Like people will be like, "Oh, deadlift train back." I'm like, they train the erector spinae really well, but there's if you're trying to thicken up your upper back, why would you choose a deadlift over a row when the traps and rhomboids all their main job is scapular retraction? So
Yeah.
in a deadlift, I'm having to disperse out a great number of that motor unit recruitment to other muscles, right? The glutes, the hamstrings, the adductors, the quads for quad contractions and like to extend the knee, the calves. So why do I want to activate all those and send out motor unit recruitment for all those muscle groups if I'm trying to train my upper back when I can just lay on a bench and do a freaking row?
Yeah.
That's shit that doesn't make sense to me when people try to make those arguments. I'm like, so why am I trying? Why am I doing loading knee extension if I'm trying to train my upper back?
Yeah. Well, what about because I think you've posted about this before, is doing like a bent over free weight barbell row or T-bar or with dumbbells versus doing chest supported, somebody who just needs to build a lot more mass, would they not get more out of that barbell row because they're involving more erectors and whatnot?
Well, if they're doing, what if they're already doing an RDL?
Yeah. Well, maybe so what if they're doing RDL, 3 days prior to that? It's not
They're
a
already doing
recovery.
it, already getting a good stimulus in their spinae erectors. So why would they do a barbell row if they're already getting that?
They wouldn't have to, I guess. Yeah. If they're so I guess they might
So if
not be
they're
doing RDLs, but
not doing the RDL, they could do something like a barbell row where they actually right they get a stimulus for the erector spinae and the upper back. But I think it's more effective to do something like an RDL to load the spine. I don't why I don't want to load the spine for a row, right? Like I don't want to load hip flexion. So if I'm doing a row, why didn't I choose the chest support every single time if I have access to it?
yeah. Well, didn't Dorian Yates have the Yates row? Is that what he did?
Yeah, he did. He did
That
have
the
the
the heavy ass right Yates row.
yeah. It was yeah the Yates row was actually supinated grip row.
Yeah,
Really, the way Dorian did it was mostly going to be lats.
but you would say doing just chest supported is always going to be better.
If you're trying to like, if you're really trying to bias the upper back, a chest support is going to be a better
Well, yeah, yeah,
spot.
yeah. Trying to bias, but I just feel like at the point where you're a beginner, this whole biasing shit really doesn't matter at that point. You train your back.
That's what comes back to what we said earlier. I think beginners can get away with with doing the big compounds. I just don't agree they all have to squat.
Okay, yeah, 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 yeah. I
But
got
like
you.
if a beginner's doing a barbell row, like, and that's like can be perfectly fine. I think there's just there's ideology that beginners have to do all these barbell lifts for some reason. I don't know why that is.
Obviously, it just depends with the whole split ups that you said, right? Like if they're doing an RDL, really doesn't matter. If they're not doing one, then sure.
I
Like,
a lot of that stuff applies throughout your whole training life. So like if I'm doing an RDL, like why I would do a barbell row. But if I'm not doing an RDL and I want to include a barbell row because I want some stimulus for my erector spinae, then I could do that. But I would never program like that.
yeah, yeah, I got you. Okay, well, we've been on here for quite some time now, about 2.5 hours. We've been about 2.5 hours. I don't want to keep you on too longer.
Did you get all your class? I feel like that you had a lot of things like in your like that you.
I just want to cover things that are like controversial because people who are watching this, they're all going to be the fucking kids from TikTok. They're going to want explanations on everything. So I try to make it so that we're explaining everything in the easiest way for them to understand here. Even though they're probably still going to have fucking questions and they're going to say some shit after this after watching it too.
I don't think there's ever any way to call that. So a lot of this stuff because of the area that I end up working from is very like deep in analysis. That's why I do work with Chris and why we're rebooting like the whole webinar stuff. So a lot of the stuff that gets repeated, people don't understand the deeper underlying mechanisms. Kind of like we were talking about with fatigue, right? Like even when you talk about like fatigue, I'm like, what you're really talking about is perception of effort or just simply feeling tired. But simply feeling tired is not actually central nervous system or peripheral fatigue. Those are measurable things. and it gets misconstrued as that. So some of these conversations, they go very deep. And like a lot of the stuff, especially like on TikTok or even Instagram or wherever on social media, will get picked up and just gets consistently repeated. And so
Hmm.
eventually it just becomes the truth because it's consistently repeated. And then when you ask somebody to explain the mechanisms, they will say something like, hey, it's like the whole just trust me, bro, or open an anatomy book. And I'm like, okay. It's like, okay, I pretty much have opened every anatomy book on the face of the planet. So, when you can explain the mechanism to me, that's why pretty much every time I write a caption or citations.
Yeah.
So I've gone back to that because we do have a lot of charlatans now across all social media platforms just saying a bunch of nonsense on a daily
Yeah.
basis.
It's hard to say shit on there because like it just a lot of things just require so much context and you can't give it in that short term
The other
content.
thing, it requires so much context, and the other thing is some people are just out to argue
Yeah,
and
literally.
get mad and like, well, you blocked me. I'm like, well, if you trolled my page or came to argue for the sake of it, then that's why you got blocked.
I
And
block everybody. That's over. You're gone.
I know I don't know understand the block button exists for a reason. We use it to protect our sanity. I don't like if you have 22 followers on your social media and 19 of them is your family members, you don't know what it's like to have 1,000 people coming at you every single day.
Yeah, and I'm not gonna sit here and fucking debate with you. Like, I don't know who you are. You don't. How do I know you know what you're talking about? You're literally just trying to fucking argue with me over some shit. This is no relevance to me. Like, you have nothing better to do with your time.
It's
Like
always a private account.
always. Yeah,
It's a private account with no pictures and that want to come up and with a full chest and want all the smoke.
yeah,
My thing is that when they complain about that, I'm like, if you ask legitimate questions, I'll answer. If it's something that requires a big discussion, like we talked about, we talked now for like what is it, like 2.5 hours. Some of the ones like it could continue on as far as like nuance. Those
yeah.
are not platforms to have those discussions.
No,
You
and
can't.
people want that black and white answer. And when you say, well, like it just depends, you're like, oh, you're fucking bro scientist. This, I'm like, I just can't give you the answer that you want that simply.
I do my best to try to give people here's what to work with and here's why, and that's why I give them studies. Here's what I will tell you this, Sebastian: the people who say I'm just trying to learn are not.
No,
They're not,
no,
because I'll
no.
tell you why. You have all of the same information in your hand that I have access to.
Yeah.
The people who really want to learn, they do they
They're not on
understand?
Tik. They're not on TikTok trying to learn.
Dude, did they understand Google Scholar exists? So to learn, I gave you a PMID. Here's how I know that you're not trying to learn. If I have 5 PMIDs in my caption and you comment 30 seconds after I post it challenging me, you didn't read those. You didn't have time to read those.
Yeah, no.
So you're not trying to learn. You're
Well,
not
people don't. It's not even people asking questions. It's them immediately just trying to challenge you. Like
yeah,
it's just them pressing you as if they know more, and it's just some random account. It's like that doesn't even have any validity or credibility to even be making those statements to begin with. So it's like, why would I even entertain this conversation?
yeah. That's why I just always say, "What? Well, can you give me a citation for that?" So if somebody can't give me a single citation, I never get a citation. The ice bathroom was a good one. I was like, you guys tried. There was like thousands of like pissed off kids in there, I guess, that dunked themselves in ice water. I'm like, well,
The
just give
ice
me a.
bats.
And actually, that's going to be some stuff. Beers and I, we're going to start our own podcast to really cover these topics in depth and
Yeah,
actually about the research because there's a lot of it's the one that's going around right now is like all muscles grow better at longer muscle length, and it's absolute bullshit.
yeah. From
That's
stress
absolute bullshit.
that all muscles benefit from stress mediated hypertrophy, and they
Absolute
don't.
bullshit. They don't.
Yeah.
And some of the articles, there's some absolute clown, like kings of the clown world that are running around saying that they do. I'm not even going to give them a shout out, but I'm just going to tell you it's going to be a massive smackdown coming on some of this stuff. There's not a,
There's a war coming.
there's one study, there's a 9-week study that shows that the incline dumbbell curl causes no hypertrophy of the biceps, none on trained individuals. So it wasn't even noobs. These are trained people, which makes sense. And then some of the other research that they're citing, they clearly didn't read it because they didn't read the methodologies. So social media is not always a space where I can get into that stuff, but Chris and I are going to get into it. I think he's been kind of fed up with the whole everybody saying all of the muscles benefit from stretch media hypertrophy. They don't. They
Well,
don't.
how do you feel? Because you're one of the few guys. A lot of like like when I started the podcast here, I asked about your background. A lot of guys on these they don't realize how long you've been around. They don't realize your experience. You're one of the few people on that app that actually will come on that app and try to educate, because most people don't want to fucking deal with it at all. They don't want to deal with the kids on there because it's crazy. It's out of control.
John told me he just posts and he never interacts. He said it's so bad. And it's all those kids' fault. They have made it that way. Like, this, the Dunning-Kruger is like out of this world bad.
It wasn't like that when 10 years ago, like, it's like, I never would have thought, like, even now, like, I mean, even when I was, younger, like, I never would have thought to go and challenge somebody like you because I saw something else. Like, I would have just listened, absorb information, and fucking that's it. Like, go on about my day, try to learn. But these motherfuckers will challenge you.
When I first got on, it was really bad, because most of the kids do at least have some idea who I am now.
Yeah.
So like a lot of them come and they're cool. So I don't want to like crap on them. There's plenty of cool kids that come there that do want to learn. But it was really bad when I first got on because they didn't know who I was. So I was like, okay, like
Yeah.
the amount of nonsense. And then they would just be regurgitating nonsense at me. And like when that happens, like you don't have the space to even respond to let them know this is just
No.
completely wrong. Because TikTok it's not meant to be a platform. It's not meant to be an educational platform.
No.
So I'm going to be creating an educational portal and platform that's going to be coming within this year. That's going to be so anybody who wants to actually really understand this stuff in depth. Chris and we're going to be developing that over the course of this year. And I will say this: and I think if you think about it, this is true. To give the kids credit, the level of their foundational knowledge is so much higher now than it was a few years ago too, though. So I'll applaud them for that. So like some of the kids really do get out there and read a lot of research and really have developed that ability to have some conversations you couldn't have like a few years ago. It was just always some dude coming in saying, well, Ronnie did it, so it must work. I mean, that shit, like, well, at
Yeah.
least like the whole Ronnie, I used to call it the was it I can't even remember now. What's that thing called where it's if you use Hitler, the argument's immediately over, you lost. There's a phrase for that. I
An ad
can't remember.
hominem?
Godwin's law. Godwin's law. So
Goblins.
Godwin's law, if you look this up, you can Google it. I think it's Godwin's law. It states that as soon as you compare something bad to like the to Hitler, you immediately lose the argument. And I think I named it Coleman's law. Was as soon as you say, "Well, worked for Ronnie," you immediately lost the argument.
Bro,
So
anything could have fucking worked for Ronnie.
Ronnie could have done Pilates, like right, and he would have absolutely been bigger than everybody else. A lot of people don't even get this, and I'm gonna have to go. Ronnie was 100% natural when he turned pro. Where he was
Yeah.
100. People will say he wasn't. Blah blah blah.
Yeah,
He
I
was
know.
200. He was 212 pounds as a pro.
People
He
just
was.
are not able to conceive that. It's just around what you've been around, what you know is possible.
Think about this. Like people,
Yeah.
if you think about a dude, think about Usain Bolt, right? Whether he's
Yep.
natural. Let's just pretend like Usain Bolt's natural. I think he probably is like he's probably natural, right? But if you think about somebody that can run that fast, that's Ronnie Coleman for muscle building, right? Like,
Yeah.
so Ronnie as a natural, I think was 212 to 215. There's natural guys that are probably 10 pounds lighter than that, but that was the difference in being that much of an outlier was basically probably 10 or 12 pounds of muscle, right? On top of what the other elite natural guys. So Ronnie was, in my opinion, probably the biggest elite, like genetic freak in terms of muscle building we've ever seen, like, and maybe ever will. And so Ronnie, I 100% know was natural when he turned pro. In those pictures you see when he
Yeah.
was a natural, you can look. He doesn't have that density. He doesn't have that same. Like it's a different look. I can look at most dudes and tell when they're on gear because I looked at enough dudes on gear. So Ronnie didn't. He didn't have that. It's a different look. He didn't have that density look. He didn't have that fullness look. He was really big and really jacked. I mean, he was 215 pounds lean. But dude, as soon as he got on, he went from 215 to 260, like 250 or 260 pounds at his next show.
Yeah.
Like, and it literally happened like over a very short period. So I'm like, what do you think he wasn't on? And he's had those really, have you ever seen his speech where he talks about how Flex Wheeler told him to get on?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
To Flex's room. He's like, he goes, I don't know why he went in and I can't win his show. And Flex is like, well, what you taking? He's like, well, I'm taking I'm taking all the supplements. I'm taking like my whey, like protein and vitamin E and A. And Flex is like, no, what are you talking about? I'm talking about, are you taking this or are you taking that? And Ronnie's like, I'm not taking any of that stuff. What are you talking about? So after that, that's when he goes, after that, I thought I'm gonna start taking. Then he wouldn't say what it was, but it was, I mean, if you know Ronnie, you have to know he's like, I have absolutely no reason to not believe, but I also know who did his drug protocol.
Yeah.
So
Well, all
um,
those guys were fucking massive hyper responders. I seen Flex and like you said, Kevin, literally like within 4 6 weeks go from 200 to 240, shredded on
yes,
stage. It's insane. It's
yeah,
literally
Kevin,
insane.
like he would go from 205, literally like 198, looked like he had never lifted a weight in his life in the off season, and he would actually do the other way. He would build into the show.
Yeah.
And he would go from like 198 pounds. 3 months later, he'd be on stage at 240 shredded.
Yeah,
Like
it's insane.
people can't fathom these things because the majority of us, 99% of us, are not working with elite genetics.
No.
So they're like, everybody has to be everybody's on gear now. I never used Trent in my life. I never used Trent. I never, even when I was using androgens, I was always open about what I used. My go-tos were test and NPP. I couldn't use DECA. DECA gave me anxiety. I figured out NPP because it's a short ester. I didn't have the same side effects. So I used test and NPP, and then I'd take some D-ball like before, like 3 weeks out. That's it. I've never hit that stuff. Every day I still people like, well, if I took as much Trent as you, I'm like, I took Trent for 8 days.
Why think these kids just think like they just like know Trent? Everybody loves Trent. I don't
I
know why.
don't
Like,
like, dude, everything is Trent now, and they just like celebrated like the whole like everybody do Trent. I'm like, dude, this for cattle. Like it's not
yeah,
even. So I don't know why the Trent thing has become so big.
it's
Like
for
I,
like when you're fucking deprived in a deficit on fucking prep and you need to retain as much tissue as you can. It's what the benefit is. It's
but you
to,
can do that with orals. You can do
yeah, you
that.
could. Yeah.
As like you don't have to take Trent to do that. I don't know what the whole. I see lots of these dudes that openly talk about using Trent. I can't tell they're even on, and I'm
Yeah.
not
They're
being.
taking it like their first, second cycle. Everybody's just so
I'm like,
test. Then
I
say test
can't
and trend.
tell. They got Trent acne, or they got like some really bad acne going on, or something. And I'm like, dude, I cannot tell. I could if you just looked at your body. I was 225 pounds when I was 18 years old, fully natty, fully natty. And when I leaned down after I was 240, after I was 255, I was 205.
Yeah.
Like I was very lean at 205. Like probably competition shape would have been around 195 to 198, like totally natural. And like I'm right at 6 foot. So like I don't a lot of these guys, like they'll be like, I'm on trend, and I'm like, dude, you are 168.
Yeah. It's
So
ridiculous.
if you're shredded now, like I'm friends with Matt Ogus. Matt, I 100% he's natural. People accuse him of being, but Matt is in contest shape is like 168 to 170 pounds. Falls right within that fat-free Matt index for a natural, but he's got great muscle bellies, he's got great shape,
Yeah.
and he great
Well, if you
condition.
look at him, he's been like relatively the same size for fucking like a decade.
Size for a decade.
Yeah.
For a decade, right? That's the other thing. Like he's been the same size for a decade. But I love Matt. Like, but people don't even believe he's natty. I'm like, but he even falls within you guys his own parameters for like what a natural can achieve as
Well,
far as
have
like
you ever seen the fucking Reddit forums, like the Natty or Not forums?
yeah, nobody's natural.
Dude, it's
No,
insane. It's
it,
insane.
nobody's natural. Those and nobody's natural.
They set the
Nobody.
bar. They set the bar so low, and it's like you don't even need to be an elite. Just train hard and eat enough, and like put in years and see what happens. Nobody does it.
Here's the thing: what a lot of people do not realize, if you get really shredded, in pictures or videos, you will look way more jacked than you actually are, right? Like if
Yeah.
people don't concept. So when you're fatter, you actually look less muscular.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
the guy won my last chat that won the winter peel challenge for the yoke squad. He lost 30 pounds. He was 170 something in the after, but look, twice as big. And
Yeah.
people were like, gotta be on steroids. I'm like, he's 177 pounds. Why
Yeah.
do why do guys in the 160s and 170s like why do they have to be on steroids? I'm like, it doesn't matter. If you're like a movie star and you get abs, you got to be on steroids. People actually in that one debated if Brad Pitt was on steroids in like Fight Club, and he was 162 pounds or something.
It's fucking insane. Yeah, a little bit of trend and clan. Those abs. Look at the shoulders. Fucking androgen receptors. Like, what the fuck are you talking about?
I always tell guys this: if you want really capped delts, get super lean. Your delts will actually pop. Your
Yeah,
delts will
because
fight.
you hold fat here.
Yeah. So as soon as you get rid of the fat around the actual delt, the delt just pops.
Yeah, people think you have to be on gear to have capped delts. I've never seen anybody take gear and their delts just become capped either. I've never seen that.
I haven't either. They always talk about this, like with the whole, with like traps and the androgen receptors. And what I think really just all that happens is most of the guys they're looking at are shredded. But
Yeah,
when a dude gets shredded, he'll have capped delts because there's no fat around it.
yeah,
How do they
yeah,
not spot? Watch a football game, watch cornerbacks. Dude, those two guys have some of the best delts you've ever seen. They're just shredded.
yeah. Literally,
Are all those guys just running trend? Is
this
every
small arms, skinny arms, they have fucking 3D delts.
Yes, yes, like massive. Their delts look massive because they don't have any fat around them.
Yeah, they
Yeah,
don't want to
that's
hear
a
that.
fact. We should have done a whole one. That could be a whole segment where it's like everybody online is on gear that basically is there's a whole paradigm. If you're if you're shredded, you have to be on gear. But if you're bigger than me, you have to be on gear too. So the only person who's not on gear is the guys that look
Dude,
like
I
crap.
fucking post pictures of me when I was like 14, 15 because I worked out. Like I worked out from a very young age. I was repping 225 and all the comments fucking, yeah, started gear at 14. What 14-year-old is injecting gear? I like, how would that even have happened? Who's attaining gear at 14?
Dude, when I don't know if you remember this because this might have been before your time. There was a time when pro hormones were on the shelves that were legit orals. They were legit orals.
At GNC.
Back when it was called, I don't even remember what all they were called, but there was tons of ones. It was literally they would change one molecule in the oral to make it quote unquote legal, but it's the same thing. So it ends up behaving the same way in the body. But you'd have like oral turinabol, D-bol, and
I think
anabol.
that was probably like early 2000s, no?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that was like yeah, early 2000s. I never even took that shit.
Yeah.
Dude, my like when I decided to go on, I went full on. Like my first test cycle was like 500 milligrams. Like that was all I did. But I was 100% natty for that. Never even took the pro hormones. A lot of those guys that claimed to be natty were taking those pro hormones. That you're not natty if you were taking pro hormones.
Yeah.
Those were
No.
real drugs. Those were 100% oral, real drugs.
Yeah, no. They didn't have that shit when I started. The only thing they had was right when I started was the time where the original Jacked was getting, fucking taken off shelves.
Yeah, because it
Jack 3D.
had methamphetamine.
Yeah. So imagine fucking me at 13 taking Jack 3D as my first pre-workout.
I never used that shit either. I didn't use anything, dude. Like people I don't think a lot of these young dudes realize how much they could get out of truly training really
Well, they all have
hard.
they have SARMs now. That SARMs wasn't around when I was younger.
Do you know like dudes use SARMs? Because to them, what they think is they can get gear results and still claim natty. That I swear to God is why they use SARMs.
Really less research on SARMs. Way
Um,
less.
I can't remember if it's peptide or SARMs, but one clearly is connected heavily to some cancer outcomes. I'm so glad I've done a lot of I've done dumb stuff, but I've done a lot of smart stuff
Yeah.
over a few days. One is I never took the pro hormones because we didn't have any. We had a lot of we have a fair at least a fair amount of research looking at stuff like testosterone, but like we don't have research like on trend. We didn't have research on pro hormones. We don't have like good research on like SARMs and peptides and stuff like that. We don't know, dude. So
Yeah, 50
these
years is gonna
guys,
go by and they're gonna find out that fucking their SARMs cause Alzheimer's or something.
dude, that's what I'm saying. Like we're gonna or tumors or something, and maybe that doesn't happen, and I hope it doesn't happen to anybody. But I'm just saying, there's so much that these dudes. I think a huge part of it, man, nobody wants to be honest about is the whole comparison thing. That was what I was talking about powerlifting earlier. It's like, it's this constant comparison. If this dude's stronger than me, that dude's more jacked than me. I don't have that anymore. I don't struggle with that anymore. Internally, I have people be like, "Why are you so angry?" Or whatever. I'm like, I'm not angry because I'm direct with you. I'm a really happy person.
That's what they always think. They think we're always angry. It's
I
just because
know
I
why.
talked in a direct manner, they think I'm like emotionally upset over a
Okay,
fucking TikTok
I,
comment.
I'm gonna. This is like a huge. This should be the whole different podcast. Here's how interactions occur a lot on social media now. Number one is most people are very entitled. Most people
Yes.
are very. They think they deserve answers. They deserve a response. And the other thing is, people love to show up with disrespect and talk to you in a shitty way. And then when you clap back at them in that same energy they're bringing, they say you're a dickhead. That's the repeated cycle. If anybody comes and they just ask me questions, I'll answer their questions. And I'm usually just short and direct because I have so many people coming at me all day long. So I can't get into like, I'm like, I'm sorry, I can't get into a deep conversation with you about these topics. Like I said, we talked for hours and just broach the surface of some of these things we could get into. So I can't get into these.
Yeah.
But if you show up trolling or with disrespect, I might clap back at you. And if I do, it's a good chance you deserve it because that's generally what happens. People will show up and they will throw shade at you, and then when you throw shade back, they're like, "Oh, this is why you're a dickhead." Or I don't understand the angry thing. I
I'm
don't angry about anything. Like I
I'm not
post,
emotionally invested into social media, but people are they're so stuck in their ego. They're like egomaniacs. Like I had some guy, I remember the other night, he commented on my video about something. He's like, I get my gear from China. He's like, nobody has real connections for farmer grade gear. And I just said, you don't. And he replied back. He was like, that's why you're 5'8". And I was like, what? And he was like, yeah, like you're fucking offended going off. I was like, you're literally the one who's being an egomaniac right now. And I'm just,
the other day, this literally happened. This is how bad it is. This is another thing that happens on TikTok. Young kids will come over and try to give what I consider like coaching advice to people asking questions, and sometimes it's wrong or just bad. And I told one guy, please stop giving. You guys need to stop giving coaching comments on my account.
yeah.
And the follow up to me just saying that was, you got to stop acting like a dickhead to the community. And I'm
Yeah.
like, tell you I don't want people to give coaching comments on my account
They
because
just
I mean
think,
it's
yeah,
my account and I don't want wrong information given because what if somebody reads that on my account and this has happened and they remember thinking they read it from me and it's wrong.
yeah, I do that all the time. I'll fucking post something and I'm not answering 300 comments, and people will literally ask questions that I answered in that video, and then other people will come in and respond to them, give them advice, and I'll see it's clearly wrong. So then
Right.
I'll just block them because I'm like, I don't want this misinformation being, a community on my page.
I'm so glad we did this podcast today because you make me feel like a normal human being because I have to do the same thing because I'm like, people will come over and they will start answering questions all over. I'm like, dude, my account is not your coaching
Yeah,
platform.
like nobody asked you. Nobody asked you. Like I just answered the video. Like he has to listen to the video better. The answer's right there.
I have to my life every single day is this. Read my caption. The answer is in the caption.
Yeah.
And you can give somebody a video with a voiceover with captions in the video and a written caption, and they will still ask a question that's answered in one of those formats.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Well, everybody listening,
say
take
what?
they said everybody listening, take notes on that. Read the fucking captions. But I'm gonna end this here. Stick on for a second. Appreciate you coming on. Appreciate your time today.
Yep.
Everybody, if you don't know Paul, you probably already do this probably while you're watching this. Go give him a follow. You got your two programs. You got two programs, right? Yolk Squad, Garage Gangsters.
I got four groups. I got Yoke Squad. Yoke Squad is for basically, like anybody who's just trying to like get fully jacked overall, and have Valkyrie for ladies. And it's more like it's a lower body glute focus. I want to turn it to a little bit more like a kind of a wellness kind of focus design. And then I have Garage Gangsters, which is like Yoke Squad for dudes at home or have limited equipment, and then Garage Gals, which is kind of an off shop for women training at home that want to focus. Although my Garage Gals group, they've been telling me we don't want to do all the booty stuff. We just want to get jacked overall too. So it's been kind of a cool group. So those are my four groups, and you can find all of those on like whole link in bio thing on my Instagram. I think TikTok does. They have the link in bio too. I think. Yeah, they do.
Yeah, they do. But actually, if anybody's watching this, you know this. If you write link in bio, if you advertise anything like in the comment section, if you write it, nobody will see it. Only you will see it. They won't show it to other people because you're marketing for them to leave the app. So they'll make you look like you could see it, but it won't actually post.
Wow, that's horrible.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. But yeah, guys, check him out. Starting a podcast too with Chris Beardsley soon. Do you know when that's going to happen?
We just had the conversation yesterday morning. We're pretty stoked about it, dude, because like I said, I feel like that we're gonna do our best to kind of put a lot of this BS that's been going around. Number one with the educational portal, which is for anybody who really wants to learn at a high level. That's what we're going to deliver. And then the second thing, the podcast. The podcast is probably going to kick off in a couple of months, but we're going to actually re-kick off the educational portal in the next few months too. But it's going to be a little different this time. But I'll try to keep everybody updated on when we're looking. We're going to try to get 20 to 30 different Zooms done that will populate the educational portal. So when you go in and you become like a paying subscriber to the educational portal, you're just going to have all of this material available to you right there. It's going to be really freaking cool, dude. Like we've been
Yeah.
working for where it's going to be really concise and direct. But then the podcast is going to be more like what we did today is going to be more free flowing. But we're going to talk about all of the data that comes out and all of this stuff, all the content creator stuff you end up reading, all this kind of stuff. So yeah, we're gonna really come after it, dude. It's gonna be a good time.
All right. Well, I'm excited for that. That'll be really good, especially that site. That sounds like it'll be fucking awesome for anybody trying to learn. So, like I said, guys, check them out. And thanks for tuning in. And we'll see you next time on the next episode of Brass Tack Bodybuilding. Peace out.